Today's story is about a crime so notorious it has been dubbed the crime of the century. But the reason for its notoriety has less to do with the crime itself and more to do with who committed it. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please downgrade the Like Button's Netflix account so they're forced to sit through all the unskippable ads. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications. An idea he had for a trip for that upcoming weekend. But when Jacob found Flora, she was not remotely interested in talking about their weekend plans because Flora was very worked up about their youngest son, Bobby. Bobby, who was 14 years old, was supposed to come home right after school, but it was now 6 p.m. and he still hadn't shown up, and she had no idea where he was. And Jacob's reaction to this news was just to feel kind of aggravated. Bobby was generally a really good kid. He was a student at a prestigious boys' school right down the road, and his teacher was convinced that Bobby was the smartest kid in his entire grade. Bobby was a member of the school's debate team and regularly beat the older kids. And Bobby was just a natural leader and very hardworking and kind. But Bobby could also be fairly irresponsible sometimes, specifically in terms of coming home on time. This was not the first time that Bobby had not come home by curfew. So Jacob told Flora, don't worry about it. This is something Bobby does. He likely lost track of time. And as Jacob and Flora are having this discussion, Bobby's older brother came into the room and suggested to his dad, Jacob, that perhaps Bobby was across the street at Richard's house. Richard was Bobby's cousin, playing tennis on their private court. Richard and Bobby were quite close, even though they were 4 years apart. Richard was 18, Bobby was 14, but they really bonded over tennis. And so that was something they did all the time. And so Jacob said he would go across the street and see if Bobby was there. And he also told his wife, Flora, to just continue to call around town and see if anybody knew where Bobby might be. And so Jacob left his mansion and began walking across the street towards Richard's family's mansion to see if his son was there. Now, this neighborhood that Jacob lived in was one of the most exclusive neighborhoods really in the entire country, but definitely within Chicago's city limits. It was called South Kenwood, and basically imagine a street where every house is a huge mansion, and every mansion is home to some business tycoon or famous person, and all the families who lived in this neighborhood had a full staff of maids and butlers and drivers and fleets of private cars. I mean, these people who lived in South Kenwood were literally the richest of the rich. And so Jacob, he gets across the street, he's standing in front of Richard's family's mansion, and he looks around the side and he can see the private tennis court where his son and Richard would always play, but it's totally vacant, and in fact, the house is just totally quiet. No one's home. When Jacob got back to his own home, he found his wife pacing around in the parlor looking really concerned, and so Jacob immediately asked her, what'd you learn? What's going on? And she would tell Jacob that she had spoken to one of Bobby's friends who told her that Bobby had umpired a baseball game after school and had left to walk back home at around 5 p.m. The school and the baseball field where Bobby would have been was only about 3 blocks away from their home. And now it was 6:30 p.m. So it's been an hour and a half since Bobby had supposedly began his walk home. And so by now he certainly should be here, but of course he wasn't. At this point, Jacob went from feeling aggravated with his son to being concerned for his son's safety, despite the fact that he's thinking, okay, well, my son is likely somewhere in this neighborhood in South Kenwood, one of the safest, richest, best places in the country. He's got to be okay, but I really want to find him. And so Jacob would call one of his very close friends who lived in this neighborhood, who also happened to be a former state senator, and he asked him to come over and basically look around the neighborhood for Bobby. When the state senator friend arrived at Jacob's house, the two men left and began walking down the street lined with mansions, making their way towards the school where Bobby supposedly had been umpiring. And when they got there, they saw there was no baseball game happening, and the school was dark and closed for the night. But Jacob and his friend decided that, maybe it was possible that after umpiring this game, when Bobby had begun his walk home, maybe he had taken a detour into the school to get something, and then perhaps the doors got shut and locked on him. And so Jacob and his friend went to the school and looked for a way to basically break into the school. And sure enough, they would find an open window, they'd open it up, they would climb inside, and they would search the entire school, but Bobby was not in there. At this point, Jacob was really starting to panic. His friend was trying to calm him down, but Jacob is now thinking, something is terribly wrong with my son. And so the two men actually ran from the school back to Jacob's house, and when they went inside, Jacob immediately called out to his wife to see if maybe she had located Bobby, but when he called Flora's name, there was no response. And so Jacob and his friend, they run inside and they make their way towards the parlor, which is where they had last seen Flora before they left. And when they walked in there, they found Flora lying on the ground, totally lifeless, with the phone off the hook right next to her hand. And so Jacob and the senator, they run over and they begin shaking Flora, and suddenly she wakes up with a gasp, and she looks up at Jacob and just begins sobbing hysterically. And after Jacob finally calmed her down, she would tell him that after they had left to go to the school, she had received a phone call. And at first, she thought it was Bobby calling to check in. But when she answered it, it wasn't Bobby. It was a man's voice she didn't recognize, who told her that Bobby had been kidnapped. He was safe for now, but if they went to police, something terrible would happen to him. This mystery man also told Flora that they would be in touch soon with more information, and then they hung up. And Flora had been so overwhelmed by what she was told that she had fainted, and that was why they found her on the ground. That night, Jacob, Flora, and the state senator friend stayed up late going over, what they should do. Of course, they wanted to go to police, but this felt like a credible threat that Bobby could be harmed if they did that. And so they just went back and forth over how to handle this horrible situation. But by 2 a.m., they had made a decision. The state senator had some close friends and connections in the police department, and so they decided that they would go talk to the police, but they would swear them to secrecy so the kidnapper or kidnappers wouldn't know the police were investigating. And so, a few hours later, when the police department opened up, Jacob and the state senator friend went to the police. They spoke to the highest ranking officer who was sworn to secrecy, and then that morning, the police would begin a quiet investigation into Bobby's kidnapping. At the same time this investigation was beginning, on the morning of May 22nd, 1924, a man named Morton D. Ballard drove through downtown Chicago in a luxury car known as a Willis Knight. He pulled this luxury car into a parking lot right next to a rental car company, and after parking the car, Morton got out, he went inside of the shop, and he handed the keys over to the clerk behind the desk. The clerk would ask Morton, how did it go with your rental car? And Morton would say, oh, it was perfect, went totally fine. After that, Morton thanked the clerk, he turned around and walked outside where another luxury car was waiting for him, being driven by his good friend, Lewis Mason. And once Morton had climbed inside, the two men smiled and drove off and disappeared into traffic. That same morning, Jacob and Flora received a letter from the kidnapper or kidnappers demanding $10,000 in small unmarked bills, and if they gave this money over, they would get their son back. And immediately, Jacob went to the bank and got the money, but before he could actually deliver the money to the kidnappers at the location they had specified in this letter, the police, who were quietly investigating, discovered a clue that would break the case wide open. It would take over a week to unravel this bizarre clue, but it all started to come together when the police brought in Morton D. Ballard and Lewis Mason for questioning. Here is the shocking story that detectives were finally able to piece together about what happened to Bobby Franks. On May 7th, 1924, so 2 weeks before Bobby went missing, Morton D. Ballard walked into a hotel in Chicago called the Morrison and rented room 1031. He would tell the front desk that he wanted them to hold his mail for him, and over the next couple of days, Morton would come in and he would get his mail from the front desk, but he didn't appear to ever actually go up to his room. Finally, a suspicious maid at the Morrison Hotel, who had been going into room 1031 every day to clean it, only to discover that Morton was not in there and the room was totally untouched and clean already, she went in one morning and saw Morton was not in there, and she would actually just open up one of Morton's suitcases that he had left inside. And instead of the suitcase containing clothes or toiletries, it just contained a bunch of random library books. As it happened, after this maid found this strange suitcase full of books, Morton stopped coming to the hotel. He stopped getting his mail, he did not claim his luggage, and he didn't pay the bill. He just kind of vanished. On May 9th, so just a couple of days after Morton first booked that room at the Morrison Hotel, Morton also opened a bank account in Chicago. He also made his first appearance at that car rental company where he asked for the Willis Knight car. The rental company would not just let anybody take a Willis Knight car. You needed a reference to show that you were someone who could pay for this type of vehicle. And so Morton's friend, Lewis Mason, would give him that reference and allow him to rent the Willis Knight car. About a week and a half later, on May 21st, so the day Bobby went missing, Morton and Lewis were driving around South Kenwood in their Willis Knight car when they spotted Bobby by himself walking down the road. Now, Lewis recognized Bobby, and he knew that Bobby was an incredible tennis player, and Lewis had a question for Bobby about a particular tennis racket. And so Lewis, who was in the front seat of the car, told Morton, who was driving, to pull over so Lewis could talk to Bobby. And so Morton pulled over, Lewis rolled his window down, he called over to Bobby, Bobby came over, and before long, Lewis and Bobby were talking about this tennis racket. And then when that conversation naturally wrapped up, Lewis offered Bobby a ride the rest of the way home, because that was where Bobby was walking to when they stopped him. And so Lewis climbed into the back seat, Morton stayed in the driver's seat, and Bobby climbed inside and sat in the front seat. And then once those two were situated, Morton pulled away from the curb and began driving towards Bobby's house. And as they were driving to Bobby's house, Bobby just kind of continued talking about this tennis racket because that was the thing they were talking about. And as he was mid-sentence, Lewis from the back seat reached into his pocket, pulled out a chisel, and then lunged forward and began smashing Bobby in the back of the head over and over again with this chisel. And as Bobby is screaming in pain and trying to protect himself, Lewis lunges forward, grabs Bobby, drags him into the back seat, and then holds him down, pulls a rag out of his pocket, and jams it into Bobby's throat. And then he closes Bobby's mouth and holds it shut until Bobby goes still. After that, Lewis kind of grimaced at all of Bobby's blood all over him, and he kind of pushed Bobby down onto the floorboards below, and then Lewis calmly climbed back into the front seat and sat down, and meanwhile, Morton has not remotely reacted to what's just happened. This is just business as usual. Morton and Lewis did not go to Bobby's house, but instead drove towards Indiana. And on their drive to Indiana, they would stop at a roadside restaurant and eat hot dogs and root beers with their car parked right near this restaurant with Bobby's body just totally exposed laying out on the floorboards of the back seat. Morton and Lewis would eventually get into Indiana, and they would head to this particular forest that Morton was familiar with because he was a bird watcher and often came out here. And when they got to this forest, they parked in this clearing, they got out, they checked on Bobby and confirmed that he was dead. So they pulled him out, they stripped all of his clothes off of him, they rolled him up in a rug, and then they dragged him over to this drainage pipe that sat underneath some railroad tracks in this swampy area, and they jammed him inside of it. And then they got back in their car, they drove back to Chicago, at which point Morton called Bobby's mother, Flora, and informed her that her son was kidnapped but alive, even though he wasn't, and don't call the police, we'll be in touch soon. That night, Morton and Lewis would burn all of the clothes they had stripped off of Bobby. They would also clean the interior of their Willis Knight rental car, and then they would play a game of cards together before going to bed. The next day, May 22nd, so the same day that police began their quiet investigation into Bobby's kidnapping, Morton and Lewis would send that letter to Jacob and Flora demanding $10,000 for the safe return of Bobby. But unfortunately, before Lewis and Morton could claim their ransom money, Bobby's body was discovered. In fact, that day he was discovered. A walker was cutting through the woods in Indiana and saw Bobby in the pipe. And so when Morton and Lewis realized that, the jig is up, the family's never going to pay for their son because he's dead, they just returned their Willis Knight rental car and went back to their normal lives as if nothing had ever happened. But unbeknownst to him, Morton had accidentally dropped his eyeglasses right next to Bobby's body when they dumped him in the woods in Indiana. And Morton's eyeglasses were very unique. In fact, there was only one store in the world that sold this particular kind of eyeglasses. And so when detectives got the call about Bobby's body being found, they would also find these glasses. And that was the big clue, because these glasses led detectives to the store where they were sold, and the owner of the store was able to say that, yep, those particular glasses were sold to Morton. And when detectives went to Morton, Morton immediately pointed the finger at Lewis, saying that Morton didn't do anything to Bobby, Lewis did. But about a week later, on May 31st, both Morton and Lewis would confess to police that they murdered Bobby. But far more shocking than what Morton and Lewis had done was who they were, because Morton and Lewis were not their real names. The two men who killed Bobby Franks were rich kids just like Bobby who lived in South Kenwood. They created two fake names, Morton D. Ballard and Lewis Mason, and then they booked room 1031 at the Morrison Hotel. Now, they had no intention of actually staying at this hotel, and so they just left that suitcase full of books inside of the room to make it appear like they were staying there. But in reality, the only reason they booked that room is they needed a physical mailing address that was connected to their fake personas. And so after booking this room, they began sending mail to Morton D. Ballard and Lewis Mason at the Morrison Hotel, room 1031. And then after collecting that mail, which served as a sort of proof of legal name and address, they were able to open a bank account in Chicago. They dumped some money into that, and then again, they used their proof of legal name and address to rent that Willis Knight car, and then used money from their phony bank account to pay for it. And then once they had their luxury car, it was time to go kill. In reality, Morton was actually a 19-year-old prodigy named Nathan Leopold. He spoke 5 languages, he had already graduated from college, and he was a nationally respected ornithologist, which is someone who studies birds. Nathan's IQ was so high, it literally couldn't be measured. His father was the president of a very successful steamship company, and Nathan was planning to attend Harvard University in the fall to get yet another college degree. And Lewis was actually 18-year-old Richard Loeb, who was Bobby's cousin and one of his best friends. Bobby and Richard played tennis together all the time in Richard's private court, which is where Bobby's father went first to go looking for his son. Like Nathan, Richard was also a genius. He was the youngest person ever to have graduated from the University of Michigan. He graduated at 17 years old. And to celebrate the occasion, Richard's father, who in today's dollars was worth about $175 million, he was a retired vice president for the major retail store Sears, he bought Richard a custom golf course. He built him his own golf course. That was his graduation present. And at the time of Bobby's murder, Richard was actually enrolled at the University of Chicago's law school studying to become a lawyer. Nathan and Richard would very proudly tell investigators that they didn't kill Bobby to get money out of his parents. Nathan and Richard were fabulously wealthy. The money meant nothing. Instead, they had come up with this scheme and killed Bobby because of their belief in the philosopher Nietzsche's concept of supermen. Men whose superiority allows them to rise above all ordinary rules, ethics, and laws. Basically, Nathan and Richard believed they were so much better than everybody else in the world that if they wanted to kill someone, They should be able to. And Bobby seemed like a pretty easy target. After Nathan and Richard confessed, they were put under arrest, but a chauffeur was allowed to come to the police station and drop off silk pajamas for them to wear in custody, and instead of being held in a cell, they were allowed to stay in a hotel. But ultimately, they both were sentenced to life in prison. Bobby's family never recovered from his murder, and his father, Jacob, would die just 4 years after his son died. As for Nathan, he would be murdered in prison in 1936 by another inmate, and as for Richard, he would serve his time and get paroled, and then die of natural causes in 1971. Today, the murder of Bobby Franks is often referred to as the crime of the century. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please downgrade the Like Button's Netflix account so they're forced to sit through all the unskippable ads. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast called the MrBallen's Podcast that puts out brand new podcast exclusive stories on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings we put out the remastered audio of our best YouTube videos. Again, it's called the MrBallen's Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen's Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen's Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We have 2 additional YouTube channels, Mr. Ballen en Espanol and Mr. Ballen Shorts. We also put out near daily content on TikTok, Facebook, and Snapchat. All of those channels are just called Mr. Ballen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. To check out our merch, join our Discord server, or just see what's going on inside of Ballen Studios, head on over to our brand new website, ballenstudios.com. So, whether I see you on Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today, I'm going to tell you the story of one of the most talked about mysteries on the internet. And I think part of the reason this story is so mysterious and so intriguing is because there's this really unsettling audio recording that sort of confounds the whole mystery and really forces you to take a stance about what you think really happened. And so I'm going to tell you the story, and towards the end, I'm going to play you that recording, and you can decide what you think really happened. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. You heard me right. We're going back to the old ways, up to 4 new uploads every week on YouTube, for real. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to clean the dishes for the like button. But instead of cleaning them, just smash all their dishes on the ground. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss. At 12:30 a.m. on August 9th, 2013, a man named Kyle Lawson was asleep in his bedroom with his wife at their home in San Angelo, Texas, when his cell phone rang and it woke him up. Kyle looked at the caller ID and saw that the call was coming in from his 26-year-old brother, Brandon. And so, Kyle picked it up, but before he could even say hello, his brother said he needed help. And then he launched into this big story that really sounded completely insane. He told Kyle he was currently driving north on Highway 277, which is this totally desolate 2-lane country road that runs through West Texas, and that 3 men were chasing Brandon. And on top of that, Brandon told his brother that, he's trying to get away from these men, but his truck was about to run out of gas. And so what he wanted Kyle to do was to, right now in the middle of the night, come meet him secretly to hand off a gas tank so Brandon could officially escape these 3 men. But as Kyle listened to this,
he was not really actually concerned, at least in terms of Brandon being in any sort of real danger with regards to these three men that were chasing him. In reality, Kyle's reaction to this was just being so annoyed at Brandon. Because after hearing this story, this frantic story Brandon's telling him in the middle of the night, he was sure that really there were no three men, that instead his brother Brandon was just high again, and he was hallucinating. He was basically having an episode that was substance-induced. So Brandon had a history of methamphetamine use. He'd been clean for the last 6 months or so, and he'd been working on, being a better partner to his fiancée, Ladessa, and also a better father to his 4 children. But just 2 days ago, Brandon had also called Kyle, but it had been to ask Kyle if he knew where he could get some drugs. Now, Kyle did not immediately say, "Oh, here's where you go to get drugs." Instead, he tried to tell Brandon, don't do it. You should not get high. You're clean. You're doing good. But he was pretty sure Brandon had not listened, because ever since that phone call, even though Kyle didn't give him any, resources for drugs, Brandon must have gone and gotten drugs anyways, because his behavior had just been completely crazy in general. In fact, right now, Kyle knew from having spoken to his parents earlier that the whole reason Brandon was even driving on Highway 277 right now was because he got into a big fight with his fiancée and was supposed to be going to his parents' house to chill out. He was basically going to time out for bad behavior. That's why he was out right now. Now, Kyle knew Brandon was very likely high, and so this was not going to be a good time to reason with Brandon and tell him to, just come home or just go to your parents' house because, there's no such thing as these three men. You're just high. He's not going to listen to that. So instead, Kyle just focused on trying to calm Brandon down because, again, Kyle is not thinking Brandon is actually in danger. He's thinking this is just a hallucination. But as Kyle tried to do that, Brandon did not calm down. He got more and more anxious, and he's continuing to talk about these three men that are gaining on him. And finally, Kyle just said, "Dude, Brandon, have you relapsed? Is that what's going on here?" But as Kyle expected, Brandon swore up and down that he was not high, and he just kept on begging Kyle to come help him fast before these men caught up to him. Come give me the gas I need so I can escape. Come on, man. At this point, Kyle felt like there was no point even talking to Brandon, and in some ways he just wanted to hang up and forget about this whole thing. This was crazy. He has his own life and his own responsibilities. He shouldn't be babysitting his younger brother. But at the same time, Kyle was very close with his brother. Even if, he resented it, he did love his brother very much. And even though he did feel like there is no imminent danger here other than maybe Brandon to himself, Kyle decided, you know what? I'm just going to go out on Highway 277. I'm going to find Brandon and just get him back home. So he told Brandon he'd be right there, and then he hung up. About 45 minutes later, Kyle drove north on Highway 277, along with his wife in his passenger seat and their 4-year-old son in the back. Kyle's wife had not wanted him to be out in the middle of the night dealing with his crazy brother all alone, so she'd insisted that she and their son come along. And so as Kyle drove down the road, he kept an eye out for Brandon's truck. Now, to set the scene for you, this really is like a desolate highway. There's no real traffic, and really in either direction, it's just kind of open plains and some shrubs and small trees. This is a big, wide open area. It's pretty easy to see way out in front of you. And so he's got a great view, even though it's nighttime, but he can't see any vehicles. There's no truck, there's nothing. His brother is nowhere to be seen. But Kyle just kept on driving and kept on looking out. He was even just sort of looking out into the fields in case, his brother had veered off the road somewhere, which seemed entirely possible. But eventually, after driving for some time, way up ahead, sort of parked half on the road, half off, was a truck. Its lights were off, it's just sitting there. It's not even idling. It's clearly turned off. But as Kyle got closer, he realized it was Brandon's truck. So he had found Brandon. And so Kyle, he pulls over to the opposite side of the road, and he parks his car, and he tells his wife and his son to stay in the car, and he's going to go talk to Brandon, who at this point Kyle is assuming is sitting in his truck, waiting for Kyle. And also keep in mind, at this point, Kyle's thinking, well, there's nobody else out here. There's no three men chasing my brother. He's probably just sitting here, high as can be, and I'm going to talk to him, and he's just going to go home, and we're going to move past this. But when Kyle walked over to the vehicle, there was nobody inside of it. Brandon's gone. And he's thinking to himself, this really doesn't make any sense, because on the ride to the truck, as they were on Highway 277, Brandon kept repeatedly calling Kyle over and over and over again, being like, come on, you gotta hurry up, you gotta get here, they're gaining on me like I'm in trouble, bring that gasoline, you gotta get here. And now that he's here, he's finally reached, clearly, Brandon's truck. It's right here, and Brandon's gone? He's gone from his truck? He didn't tell him that on the phone. Like, where is he? What's going on here? And so Kyle, he's like looking under the vehicle. He's searching the vehicle now for his brother, which is totally crazy. Like, what's his brother doing here? But as he's searching the vehicle for his brother and looking around the area for his brother, Kyle's phone rings, and it's Brandon. And so Kyle, who at this point is feeling really annoyed, he answers the phone and he's like, Brandon, where are you? And Brandon goes, bro, I'm right here. And Kyle's like, no, you're not. Like, I don't see you. There's no one here. Your truck is here. You're not here. But just then, Kyle looked out and there was a car coming towards him. So he saw the headlights and he realized it was a cop car. And so he's on the phone with Brandon. He's looking out at this cop car that's coming up this road towards him and clearly slowing down. Like the police officer is going to stop and talk to Kyle, presumably. And so as this cop car is coming in and slowing down right in front of him, Brandon on the phone says to Kyle, run away from that cop. Now think about this. That meant Brandon had to be somewhere nearby because he can clearly see the cop car approaching Kyle. He's watching the scene. Even though Kyle has not found his brother, Brandon is clearly actually nearby. But Kyle, he's sort of quickly interpreting this and he's thinking, like, where is Brandon? Because he's looking out and it's just open fields in either direction on either side of this highway. It's like this barren wasteland out in the middle of Texas. Like, where is he hiding? There's nowhere to hide. There's a couple of shrubs and really small trees sort of off in the distance, but like there's really nowhere to hide. So where is Brandon? And Kyle, he's just feeling furious at this point. Confused, but furious. It's like, what are you doing, Brandon? Like, he knew the reason Brandon wanted Kyle to run also is because Brandon had an active warrant out for his arrest that had to do with a drug charge. And so he's just protecting himself, like, don't get involved with the police, like, keep me out of it. And it's like, Kyle, he's already out here in the middle of the night doing this crap for his brother who's completely off his rocker. Like, he was so annoyed, but again, it's like, what does he even do? He has no idea where Brandon is. And so Kyle, he was about to say something to Brandon to demand, where are you? Come out here. But Brandon hung up. Now, by this point, the police officer had arrived on scene. He had parked his car and he walked over to Kyle, who now is standing right next to his brother's vehicle. He's put his phone back in his pocket. And the officer, when he got close enough, he introduced himself as Deputy Neal of the Coke County Sheriff's Department, and he told Kyle that he was responding to a 911 call from a trucker about a stranded driver on the road. And so he asked Kyle if maybe that was him. Is this your truck? Are you the stranded driver? Pointing to Brandon's truck. But Kyle said no, it was not his. It belonged to his brother. But despite how much he really wished he could say the truth, he wanted to protect his brother, so he couldn't tell the deputy that, well, the reason my brother left his car here is because he's probably high on meth, and he's somewhere nearby hiding, and also he has a warrant out for his arrest. So instead, Kyle said, well, I think he went off to get some gas, because he called me and he said he had run out of gas, so he parked his car here, so he probably has walked on, and I just got here. Is it okay with you if I get back in the car with my wife and son and just drive up and down the road here to find Brandon? Because I'm sure he's fine, but he called me to help get him gas. So do you mind if I do that? And surprisingly, the deputy was like, yeah, that's fine. Go ahead. And so Kyle, he got right back into his car with his wife and his son, and he did fire up his car and he drove farther down the highway. And as he did, he kept looking over his shoulder to see what the cop was going to do. And the cop was just still parked next to Brandon's car. And eventually, when Kyle drove far enough that he knew the cop couldn't see him anymore, he pulled over to the side of the road and he began really angrily calling his brother over and over and over again to get him back on the phone. But Brandon never answered the calls. And so at this point, Kyle has no idea what's going on with Brandon. I mean, he didn't before, but now especially, he's out of contact with his brother. And so Kyle and his family would sit there for a little bit longer, like continuing to try to get in touch with Brandon, but to no end. And eventually, Kyle's 4-year-old son began crying and complaining because it's so late and he's tired. And, Kyle's wife is tired. It's 2 a.m. And Kyle, he's just so over it. He's like, you know what? Brandon is an adult. I tried to come out here and get him out of this mess, but if he doesn't want to be in touch with me and he wants to hide off the side of the highway, that's on him. I'm taking my family and I'm going home." And so that's what he did. He turned around, he drove right back the way he came, and he actually passed by his brother's truck that was still there, so Brandon clearly is still in hiding. And standing next to his brother's truck is still Deputy Neil. He presumably was waiting for Brandon to show back up. He drove right past them, he went back to his home, and they went to bed. And he figured, you know what, tomorrow I will likely hear from Brandon, and he'll tell me some crazy story explaining what really happened, but you know what, whatever, that's on him. Not long after Kyle had driven past Deputy Neil on his way back home, Neil decided, you know what, I'm not just gonna sit here all night waiting for Brandon. He had searched Brandon's truck and there was nothing concerning inside of it. There was, no phone, no wallet, no keys, things that people would not leave behind if they ran out of gas and decided to go walk to get gas. So it seemed very much like that is what happened. Brandon had pulled his car over, gotten out, and begun the walk. And then his brother showed up and the whole thing was playing out here. And so Neil figured, okay, well, I have other calls to go to. It doesn't seem like this is a huge emergency. And so he just reached inside the truck, he turned on the hazard lights, then he locked all the doors and shut them. And then he got in his own vehicle and he took off because again, he had other calls to attend to that night. The next morning around 8 a.m., Deputy Neil was back out on Highway 277 just to make sure Brandon had eventually come back and claimed his truck. But no, the truck was still sitting there, hazards on. Now, at this point, Deputy Neil was starting to get a bit concerned about Brandon because, he's out on foot, walking to get gas for his truck. And even though it seemed like the risk was sort of low for him, it is possible something could have happened to him. And that's why he had not come back to his truck. Maybe he was hit by a car or, got lost or something. Who knows? Anything could have happened. Or, maybe Brandon decided not to claim his truck yet. Maybe he just went home and he's gonna get it later. But regardless, it just seemed like Neil really had to go follow up personally with Brandon just to make sure he was okay. And so Neil drove back to the sheriff's department to see if he could find the contact information for Brandon. But when he walked in the door, he didn't have any time to do any digging because another employee told him that while he was out, the department had gotten a call from Brandon's fiancée, Ledessa. And Ledessa had given them a very different story than the one Brandon's brother, Kyle, had told Neil the night before. According to Ledessa, she and Brandon had been fighting for the past few days. And last night, so on the night that this whole truck thing happened, Brandon was supposed to be on his way to his parents' house to cool off from the fight he was having with Ledessa. But he never arrived at his parents' house, and he never came back to Ledessa's house. And so Brandon was totally unaccounted for. And on top of that, nobody could get in touch with Brandon. They were calling and texting him, no response. After hearing this, Deputy Neil was surprised and also pretty angry because clearly Brandon's brother Kyle had acted like everything was totally fine the night before, but that had to have been a lie, because Ledessa is saying this totally different story. And so the first thing Neil did is he went and spoke to Kyle and also to the rest of Brandon's family to get the story straight here. And very quickly, it became clear to Deputy Neil that any omissions or even lies about what had happened exactly on the night that Kyle went missing were not because the family was hiding something. I mean, they were kind of trying to protect Brandon, but it was because they didn't understand how serious this situation really was. And so now that Brandon really was missing and nobody knew what happened to him, the family was very forthright that they really didn't know what had happened to him and that yes, maybe he was on drugs, we don't know, but he really is missing and you gotta go look for him. And so that's what Neil did. Over the next 4 days, there was this huge search that Neil led all around Highway 277, where the center of the search was where Brandon's truck had been found. But despite using canines and helicopters and these huge search teams, some of which had thermal cameras which would allow you to see body heat, despite covering this vast area all around where Brandon clearly had been, there was absolutely no sign of him. And they also spoke to the homeowners and the property owners sort of roughly in the area to see if maybe they had seen something strange, maybe seen Brandon or those 3 men that apparently had been chasing him on the night he went missing, but nobody had seen anything. And so basically, Brandon was definitely not here. And there was no sign he had been here other than his truck. That was it. And so Deputy Neil and the rest of the authorities who were involved in this search ultimately came to the conclusion that based on the fact that Brandon had clearly been fighting with his fiancée, that he had an active warrant out for his arrest, and that he had not been seen in days and there was no sign of him anywhere, nothing, that what must have happened here is Brandon fled. That he's not here because he chose not to be here. That he was never in any danger. He fled the area, and looking here is going to do nothing. We basically have to wait for Brandon to show up at some point. And so for the most part, this seemed like a pretty open and shut case. Until Brandon's fiancée, Ledessa, came into the station in person with a bombshell. On August 13th, 2013, so 4 days after Brandon went missing, this is right around the time the search has been called off, the officer on duty at the Coke County Sheriff's Department sat across from Ledessa. And Ledessa looked extremely upset. And she said that she'd gotten so worried about Brandon that she'd started searching through their cell phone records. And she'd found something really concerning. She pulled out a piece of paper and she handed it to the officer, and she pointed at a specific section. And this officer, he realized quickly that this was a printed out copy of Brandon's call logs. And what Ledessa was pointing to was a call that Brandon had made at 12:50 a.m. on the night he disappeared. In between a flurry of calls to Kyle and also to Kyle's wife, Brandon had also placed a call to 911. Ledessa told the officer that the fact that Brandon himself had called 911 actually terrified her, because Brandon would have done practically anything to avoid the police. He was terrified of the police. In fact, she knew from talking to Kyle that Brandon had even suggested to him that he should run from the police on the night he went missing when he saw the cop approaching him. And so she said, look, like he would only ever call the police if he truly had to. But she's like, why then, after calling the police, did he presumably run away? It just doesn't make any sense. And all of this came as a total surprise to this officer and to the sheriff's department. Because until this moment, the belief had been that a trucker had called 911 about a stranded driver, and that was how Deputy Neal got involved, and really this whole thing started. But nobody knew there had also been this other 911 call from Brandon himself. The 911 dispatch in the area was tiny, underfunded, and understaffed. And at some point, someone must have just dropped the ball when it came to informing the sheriff's department about Brandon's 911 call, because they really didn't know about it. But now that they did, they needed to hear that call for themselves. The sheriff's department would contact that 911 dispatch, and they would send them an audio recording of Brandon's call. And when they listened to it, they were shocked. Because one, Brandon 100% sounded like he was in imminent danger. This was not like a low-stakes call from a stranded driver. This was someone who thought they were in real peril here. And then two, if you listen closely, you can hear the sound of somebody else's voice in the background on Brandon's side of the call shortly before it cuts out.
911 emergency.
Yes, I'm in the middle of the field. It's like we're just pushing guys over. Right here going towards Javelin on both sides. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. Got chasing to the woods. Please hurry.
Okay, now run that by me.
I'm not talking to him. I actually ran into him.
Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
Got the first guy.
Do you need an ambulance?
Yeah, no, I need the cops.
Okay. Is anybody hurt? Hello? Hello? Hello?
And so at this point, authorities are thinking, okay, this doesn't necessarily seem like this is just a disappearance. This might be a murder. I mean, they didn't have a body, but the idea that there's another voice and he's talking about being chased through the woods and there's these men coming after him, I mean, this audio recording gave a lot of legitimacy to that. And so the search, which had just ended, was quickly resumed and expanded dramatically. And for the next year, with all these additional resources being poured in, there was this massive effort to find Brandon Lawson. But they didn't find him. There was no other sign of him. He was just completely gone. They looked everywhere around that highway 277, all over the place near where his truck was. There was no evidence. He was just gone. And so ultimately, Brandon's case went cold. And for the most part, authorities just kind of moved on. But Brandon's family did not move on. His fiancée, Ledessa, would go on to hire 2 private detectives, and they would both conduct these big searches multiple times over around the area where Brandon left his truck and also across the state. But they too also just came up empty. And as the years passed by without answers, Brandon's disappearance captured more people's attention, and it started being featured on TV shows and podcasts. People had all kinds of theories about what had happened. Maybe Brandon really was just high and hallucinating, and he wandered off somewhere and got attacked by wild animals. Or maybe he really was being chased by these 3 men, and they kidnapped or killed him, and maybe that voice you hear on the recording was one of those 3 men. Or maybe he really had just fled the area on purpose, like the sheriff's department originally thought. Nobody really knew. And so for 9 years, Brandon's case was full of questions and 0 answers. But then, in January of 2022, a small group of volunteers went out to Highway 277 to the area where Brandon had disappeared, which had been searched so many times over. They, this small group of volunteers, would make the biggest breakthrough in Brandon's case in nearly a decade. While they were combing through this field off the side of the highway, again, a field that had been searched numerous times by hundreds and hundreds of people, these volunteers came across an old pair of shorts and pieces of 2 white shoes. They called the sheriff's department, and very quickly, a team of deputies arrived and cordoned off the area, and they continued the search. And in that same field, not far from the shorts and the shoes, they found a fragment of a human skull. And DNA testing confirmed the skull fragment belonged to Brandon Lawson. Now, you would think that finding some of Brandon's remains would answer at least some of the questions about his disappearance, but actually, it just made the whole thing more baffling, because the area where Brandon's skull was found was right near his truck. It had been searched so many times. There were thermal cameras and canines and helicopters and hundreds of searchers, and nobody found it? Remember, off the side of the highway, this is not some thick forest. It is like this huge, flat field in West Texas with nothing but grass and short cactus plants and scattered trees. Like, this is an easy place to find stuff. Yet this skull fragment was not found, nor were the shorts or the shoes. It just seems so improbable. So where does that leave us? Well, we basically have 2 options here. Option 1 is, despite the enormous manpower, the helicopters, canine units, the thermal cameras that were used, the hundreds of volunteers and searchers that combed this area for years, either they just didn't see the grown man in bright white sneakers who was in this barren strip of West Texas where it's easy to see anything, they just didn't see him. So that's option 1. Or 2, he wasn't there. Brandon was not in the search area when they were looking for him. He was somewhere else. But if you believe option 2, the question becomes, well, where was Brandon? Where was he? Why did he call 911 and then run away and go somewhere else? Why? Where was he? And then also, even if you answer that, how did his skull fragment and his clothes wind up back in the search area 9 years later? It is one of the most profound mysteries on the internet, and to this day, we still don't have a good answer. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. And today, I'm going to tell you 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please break into the like button's water supply and fill it with permanent red dye. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't At about 8:20 in the morning on June 29th, 2025, An 83-year-old woman named June Baxter shuffled her way down the hallway of her small home in Attleboro, which is a quiet town in eastern England. As she walked, she had to keep one hand on the wall to keep her balance. She was pretty frail these days and also just had a lot of medical problems. But she also really valued her independence, and so she was determined to keep living alone, even if it was kind of risky. So June used to live with her husband and their dog. But about 7 years earlier, her husband had gotten really sick, and so because of that, they'd had to give their dog to their granddaughter because they just couldn't take care of it anymore and also care for him. And then unfortunately, June's husband did pass away, and so she was left all alone. But even though she was, all alone in terms of living in the house by herself, she wasn't completely isolated. Her granddaughter, who she had given the dog to, lived close by and visited a whole bunch, and almost always brought along June's old dog, which June loved. Now, in addition to just being good company, June's granddaughter also regularly made herself available to help June with all sorts of basic things, like picking up her prescriptions and going grocery shopping for her and, driving her to and from doctor's appointments. Like, she was really available to her. But despite June knowing that, knowing she could always call on her, she tried hard not to call on her granddaughter, because again, she just really liked being independent. So on this particular day, she, continued slowly walking down the hallway, guiding herself by holding onto the wall, and then she turned the corner to go to the bathroom. And when she stepped inside, she slipped on the tile. And as she was falling to the ground, her leg scraped the corner of the bathroom counter. Immediately, June's leg started bleeding, and June's yelling out in pain, but she lives alone, nobody can hear her. And so June quickly went from, just reacting to the pain and the blood. June was scared. I mean, this is the exact scenario that she was so worried about, getting hurt when she was all alone, because she didn't really have a plan. It was like, I'm gonna live alone, so help me. But fortunately for June, she had installed throughout her house all these emergency call bells that would allow her to basically, hit the bell, and they were programmed to contact both her granddaughter and also the local emergency services. And in the bathroom, there was one of these bells. And so once she kind of composed herself a little bit, grabbed the string for this bell, and she pulled it. About 10 minutes later, June was still in the bathroom on the ground, holding onto her leg wound, when she heard the front door of her house swing open. And immediately she heard the sound of her granddaughter calling out for her. And June, as best as she could, even though her voice was a little bit weak, she called out and said where she was. A moment later, June's granddaughter, along with June's old dog she'd brought along, came bombing around the corner, and they looked into the bathroom and they saw, June and her horrible leg wound, and clearly the granddaughter is really worried right away. I mean, this was a very bad cut. But, for June, she's looking at her granddaughter and she's just flooded with relief because she knows no matter how bad this is, her granddaughter is here, everything's fine, and also her dog was here, which made everything better already. And so while June's granddaughter began rummaging through the bathroom to look for some bandages, June just kind of relaxed and just began petting her dog, who was clearly very worried about June. This is her dog previously. They had a very strong bond. And so she's just petting her dog, and then, June's granddaughter did find some bandages, and she wrapped up June's leg. And then by the time the paramedics got there, June actually was feeling basically okay. I mean, her leg definitely hurt, but she was very calm at this point. A couple of minutes later, the paramedics arrived, and by this point, June was actually feeling basically back to normal. I mean, her leg definitely still hurt, but again, her granddaughter had put that dressing on it and basically stopped the bleeding, and also June has her dog that she's petting, like her comfort animal. And so she was very calm. Paramedics come in and they assess her and they take off the dressing to check the wound. And after they cleaned it, they said, look, this is a pretty minor cut. You don't even need stitches. I think you're okay. Just be careful and maybe have your granddaughter stay here for a little bit just to make sure you don't fall again. But you're okay. Like, we're going to go. And so June, she thanked the paramedics as they walked out the door. And then she and her granddaughter and the dog just sort of sat there feeling grateful that this fall wasn't more serious. However, the next morning when June woke up, she knew something was wrong because, all she's doing is laying in bed, but her heart is racing, she's sweating, she's lightheaded, like clearly something is off here. Now, the day before, after the paramedics left, her granddaughter did stick around for a little bit, but really, June was okay, and so June was alone. And that night, she had some soreness around the cut, but it really wasn't that serious. She really felt like dodged a bullet there. But now, 12 hours later, something's going on here. Now, June had no way of knowing if her current symptoms were indeed connected to her, minor cut on her leg. But her concern that maybe this was serious and could potentially spiral really quickly made her not pull on one of those emergency bells, but instead she just picked up the phone and called an ambulance to take her to the hospital. When she got to the hospital, doctors immediately began running all these tests on her. And very quickly, they determined that she did have a very severe bacterial infection, which she must have gotten after cutting her leg. And unfortunately, that infection had already spread into her blood, which would explain why she was feeling sweaty and lightheaded and why her heart was racing. Now, the medical staff definitely had some questions, like how in the world could this have developed so quickly, especially after the paramedics the day before had, at least according to them, properly cleaned this wound before they left. But, their issue now was not how did this happen, but instead just stabilize June, treat her. And so right away, they began treating June with general antibiotics to try to fight off this infection. But it just wasn't working. And June was 83 and already in relatively poor health, and her condition was clearly deteriorating rapidly. So the doctors began running more tests to try to determine exactly what type of bacteria was causing this infection. Because if they knew that, they might be able to give her more targeted treatment than just general antibiotics, which clearly were not working. And they did eventually identify this bacteria. But by the time they did, June had unfortunately already developed sepsis, which is a life-threatening condition that occurs when a person's body tries so hard to fight off an infection that it basically ends up damaging their vital organs in the process. Medical staff did everything they could, but it wasn't enough. And so eventually, 1 week after going to the hospital, June passed away. It would turn out the deadly bacteria that found its way into June's open wound was introduced to her by her granddaughter, completely by accident. The bacteria is called Pasteurella multicida, and it's found in a very specific place, inside the mouths of domestic dogs. While June laid on the bathroom floor waiting for her granddaughter to find bandages to wrap up her leg, June's old beloved dog, who her granddaughter had brought over, was trying to comfort June, and June was allowing the dog to do that. But what the dog was actually doing to comfort June, was licking her open wound. And so that led to the bacteria going in, and it would kill June 1 week later. On the afternoon of March 4th, 2000, a 40-year-old woman named Ines Ramirez stood in the kitchen of her tiny one-room home, which was deep in the mountains of Oaxaca, Mexico. Ines had a whole chicken on the counter right in front of her that she had just killed and plucked, and now she was using a 6-inch-long knife to butcher it for their dinner. And as she did this, every once in a while, she would look out the window to check on her 7 kids who were playing together out in the yard. So Ines and her large family lived in a very isolated rural community of about maybe 500 people. They didn't have running water or electricity or a phone, and they lived miles away from their closest neighbors. They mainly lived off of corn and vegetables that they grew themselves, chickens they raised, and then wild animals that Ines's husband would catch. Her husband was actually gone that day because he was out in the mountains hunting for deer. And so as Ines is just kind of going about her fairly typical evening routine here, making dinner, she suddenly felt this really intense, very painful cramping sensation that was kind of ripping through her abdomen. And it hurt so bad that Ines stopped what she was doing and kind of doubled over and grabbed the counter and just tried to steady her breathing. I mean, this was really shocking. And for about a minute, Ines just stood there, holding onto the counter, just waiting for this pain to pass, and eventually it did. And once it eased up, it was like, okay, she was back to normal and she could stand up again. But this was sort of alarming. But at the same time, Ines was used to dealing with basically all medical crises on her own. They lived in this isolated part of the world, and the nearest medical clinic was 50 miles away, and they didn't have a car. So, like anything that happened, they basically had to deal with it themselves, and that was routine. And so for Ines, despite how incredibly painful this was, she just told herself, now that it had passed, the pain was gone, she said, you know what? It's probably fine. I'm good. And so pretty quickly, she just kind of forgot about it and went back to butchering the chicken. But several hours later, this is after midnight now, the pain came right back. And at this point, Enos, she's in this one common room in her house where all her kids are fast asleep. It's past midnight now, and she's sitting on this bench and she's gripping her abdomen, rocking back and forth as this pain just rockets back and forth across her abdomen constantly. There's no relief, nothing. And she's trying so hard not to make a sound because she doesn't want to wake her kids up, nor does she want to scare her kids. Her husband is still off in the mountains hunting for deer, so she is alone. She just has this little flickering candle nearby. That's the only light she's got, and she's just isolated, dealing with this excruciating pain. And so at this point, Enos really felt like this could be a real problem. This might not be something she could just brush off and let pass on its own. This was real. This was an actual emergency. But what can she even do? There's nowhere to go. She can't do anything. She is just completely trapped here with this excruciating pain that's making it hard to even have coherent thought. It's so bad. But the one thought that kept going through her mind was she had to do something, or whatever this was. It felt like it was going to kill her. And so Enos felt like she really only had one option here, and it was a horrible, horrible option. But she knew she had to do it. And so she got up and she's hunched over in pain, and as quietly as she could, she walked over to a cabinet and she opened it up and she grabbed a small bottle of alcohol. And she took a few sips to kind of numb the pain a little bit. And then after she had done that, she turned around and, still with this blinding pain, she hobbled into the kitchen and she grabbed that 6-inch knife she had used earlier to butcher the chicken. And then she walked right back over to the bench near that candle that she'd been sitting on earlier. And once she was there, she reached down and she pulled up her shirt, exposing her abdomen, where this pain was coming from. And then she took the knife and she plunged it into her abdomen. And immediately she let out this blood-curdling scream. She couldn't help it. And she was sort of vaguely aware of all her kids waking up and sort of making their way over to her, but she was so focused on what she was doing, and she began slowly dragging this blade down her abdomen all the way to her belly button. And then she pulled out the knife and she can barely think. It's so painful. Her kids are crying. And then she plunged the knife back into her abdomen and raked it down the other side, creating this massive gash in her stomach. And then she kind of dropped the knife and she's screaming. She can't even help it, and her kids are all crying. And she takes her hand and she reaches into her stomach and she's fishing around. Every little move is like lightning striking her body. But she eventually finds what she's looking for and she pulls it out of her stomach. And what she's looking at is her 8th child, a baby boy. And she had enough wherewithal to take that knife and cut the umbilical cord and place the baby down before she passed out. After Enos lost consciousness, one of her kids left the house and just started running to go find the nearest person to get some help. And miraculously, after finding some people, when those first responders got to the home where Enos was hours later, they found her and her newborn son alive. And they were taken to the closest hospital for emergency treatment, and they would both make full recoveries. Today, Enos Ramirez is the only woman ever who has performed a successful C-section on herself. In the early morning hours of December 3rd, 1921, a 62-year-old woman named Augusta Roblin lay awake in her bedroom inside of her daughter's house in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Augusta had lived with her daughter now for about a year. She had moved in after her husband had passed away. She just really hated being alone, and at night in particular, it was difficult to sleep sometimes. Just the weight of the loneliness was very intense. And also, Augusta was known to have really visceral bad dreams, and so that, combined with loneliness, made living alone really awful. So here she was, living with her daughter. But on this particular night, Augusta, she was wide awake in bed because she had had one of these awful nightmares, but she knew she could not tell her daughter about it. Now, normally one of the ways that Augusta would cope with these terrible nightmares, even when she was living alone, is she would get in touch with her daughter and they would talk about it. They would try to figure out if there was meaning in this awfulness of these nightmares. And sometimes they felt like they did find deeper meaning, and it sort of was cathartic for Augusta. But on this night, the dream she had just had, this nightmare, this visceral, awful nightmare, she knew, based on what she believed it meant, she absolutely could not tell her daughter anything about it. She had to hide it at all costs. In the dream Augusta had just had, she kind of came to and she was in her daughter's basement. So in the basement of the house she was in right now. And in front of her on the ground were these two perfectly circular, very, very deep holes, just that went straight into the ground. And so Augusta, she found herself walking towards the edge and looking over. And she saw it was like this unbelievable abyss in each hole. It's like it went on into infinity. But despite this innate fear she had for these holes, she sat down on the edge of one of these holes and basically dangled her feet over this, cataclysmic abyss below her. And as she's sitting there like a child dangling her feet, these two men in dark clothes, they wander over out of the shadows and they walk behind Augusta. They don't interact with her. And they go to the other hole, the hole that is next to Augusta. And she looks at these men and they're not looking at her. They're doing something. They're clearly in the middle of some sort of act. And they pull this huge carpet seemingly out of nowhere. And the two men stretch it out over this other hole next to Augusta. And they lay it over the hole. And as soon as Augusta saw that, she suddenly understood what was happening here. And she was horrified. So she woke up. And now here she was, knowing that based on what she just saw in her mind's eye in this horrible nightmare, that she could never share it with anyone, that she would live with the secret. So Augusta would eventually fall back to sleep that night. And she would get up in the morning and she would not tell her daughter, Henrietta, anything about this dream she had had. She played it off like everything was just fine. But over the course of the day, Henrietta, even though she didn't say anything, began to notice that her mom was just acting really weird, like something was on her mind. And finally, at night, when the two of them sat down for dinner, this is basically, 24 hours, give or take, from when Augusta had this dream, right? They're sitting down for dinner, and Augusta, she's not eating, she seems totally disconnected, and she just seems off. And Henrietta's like, Mom, what is going on with you? And Augusta, at this point, realized she must be giving off very negative vibes here. And so she told her daughter, don't worry, I'm fine, I'm sorry, I'm not hungry. Everything's fine, I'm just feeling a little bit off. So everything's fine. But Henrietta realistically did not believe her mom, but she didn't push her. She said, okay. And they finished their dinner, and then before long, Augusta had gone to bed. But the next morning, when Henrietta got up, she went downstairs expecting to see her mom, but Augusta was nowhere to be found. And so again, feeling kind of concerned about her mom's behavior, she went to Augusta's bedroom to check on her, and she found her mom seeming really weak and lethargic and just totally out of it, laying in bed. And she asked her mom, really, what's going on with you? Are you not feeling well? What's happening here? And her mom just said, I just don't want to get out of bed. I'm feeling under the weather. I'm going to stay here. But even though Henrietta could see her mom was clearly downplaying this, she just felt like there's too many red flags. So she called a doctor. And a doctor came to the house, and a doctor examined Augusta, and they determined that, it wasn't really clear exactly what was going on with her. Clearly she's not feeling great, but the only thing they found was that her heart sounded a little bit weak. And so the doctor suggested that Augusta just, rest, have some water, eat some food, and just stay in bed, and you should get better. But despite Augusta doing what the doctor said and basically remaining on bed rest, she didn't get better. And in fact, Henrietta, her daughter, is watching, and she's clearly seeing that not only is her mother deteriorating physically, but she was also becoming more and more despondent and sort of disconnected emotionally. It was like she was drifting off into some other world that Henrietta was not a part of, and she was just so worried about her mom. And so finally, on December 7th, so this is for reference, 5 days after Augusta had that visceral nightmare that she felt like she couldn't share with anybody, Henrietta went into her mother's room and she sat on the edge of the bed and she said to her mom, you gotta tell me what's going on. It seems like there's something else here that you're not sharing with me. You gotta tell me. I don't care what it is, but I gotta know. Augusta, when she heard her daughter saying this, she sort of thought about trying to keep doing the same thing she was doing, which was, basically say everything's fine and push her daughter off. But she could tell Henrietta was not going to take that for an answer. And so Augusta sighed and she said, I had that dream again. Except this time, I watched the procedure. Now, to us, this is, cryptic and weird and doesn't really mean anything. But to Henrietta, who understood what her mom was talking about, she was completely horrified. It would turn out Augusta really did have horrible nightmares that plagued her for at least the last year or so. But it was like a recurring nightmare. She didn't have different variations. It basically was the exact same nightmare that just really upset her. The way it went is, she would open her eyes in this nightmare, and in front of her would be these two bottomless pits, these huge holes in the ground. Now, she wouldn't know what these holes are, but she'd be able to tell that she was in an environment that she recognized. One time she saw that she was in her sister-in-law's garden. Another time she saw she was in her neighbor's backyard. She knew where she was, but she didn't understand these holes. But in this nightmare, she would always walk up to the holes, and then she, not two men who walked in, but she would take a rug out and cover up one of those holes, and then she'd wake up. Now, on its face, this does not sound like a particularly frightening dream. But there's a connection to the real world that made it frightening. Every time Augusta would have these nightmares, the person who lived at the property where the dream took place, the sister-in-law's garden, the neighbor's backyard, when she would have that dream, she would come to, and then within a couple of days, that person would die, usually inexplicably. It was like a harbinger of doom that these dreams represented who was going to die next. And so every time she had this dream, she knew someone's going to die. But in that last dream she had, the one, 5 days earlier that scared her so badly, she knew she couldn't tell Henrietta. In that dream, it was the first time she, Augusta, didn't perform the procedure, i.e. putting the rug over one of the holes. Those two men came over and they did it. And Augusta realized she's sitting with her feet in the other hole, and she's realizing she's in her daughter's basement. That's where this dream's taking place. This must mean she, Augusta, is next. And wouldn't you know it, just days after telling her daughter about this, within 2 weeks of having this dream, Augusta died of heart failure in her daughter's house. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, I'm going to share 3 stories about people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place. Driving it. And the highway she was on had this amazing view of the beach and ocean down below. And so that day, Nancy rolled down her window so she could feel the ocean breeze as she drove. And then she took in a deep breath and she smiled. At the same time Nancy was doing this, a police lieutenant was driving in his car a couple cars back from Nancy, and as he was just driving along, he suddenly sees this yellow Camaro that to this point had been driving completely normally, suddenly veer off the road, miraculously missed the oncoming cars, and then smashed into a tree on the side of the road. And so the police lieutenant instinctively jammed on his brakes and veered over to the shoulder and stopped behind the Camaro. And as the lieutenant got out of the car, he was thinking clearly the driver must have just had some kind of medical emergency, because he didn't see any obstacles in the road, and the car, the Camaro, had been driving completely normally to that point. So what would cause them to veer and crash into the road at such a high speed other than a medical emergency? And so the lieutenant jumps out of the car, runs over to the driver's side window, and he looks inside, and he sees this teenage girl, this blonde teenage girl, and she's slumped over the wheel, and she's not looking up at him, she's not making any sound, she's just sitting there. And so he opens up the door and he asks her, are you okay? And she didn't say anything, but she did moan. And so she was breathing, she was alive, and there weren't any obvious physical injuries. Clearly she's just crashed into this tree at high speed, so she's definitely shaken up. But there weren't any obvious grievous injuries that have occurred here, at least none that he could see. And so he asked her again, hey, are you okay? What's going on here? And she just continued to moan. And so again, considering he's looking at her and she seems, basically okay, all things considered, he thought, maybe she's drunk. That would kind of explain, the sudden veering off the road. And so at this point, the lieutenant radioed for backup and also called for an ambulance. And while he waited, he began searching the car, just basically looking to see if maybe there was some clue in the car as to what happened here. For example, containers of alcohol. And so he's looking around and he doesn't see any empty bottles and he can't smell any alcohol in the car. But still, this whole time, the girl is not responding. She's just moaning and just kind of slumped over there. And then a couple of minutes later, he hears sirens and he looks up and a bunch of first responders came over. They pulled the girl out of the car, got her in the ambulance, and off to the hospital she went. Once Nancy got to the hospital, medical staff was able to determine that she was not drunk, but she did clearly appear to be having some kind of medical emergency. But they didn't know what it was. And again, there was no visible injuries on her. She just basically looked really shaken up and was non-responsive. And quickly, after Nancy was at the hospital, her condition only got worse, to the point where doctors were giving her shots of adrenaline to try to keep her alive. But it didn't work. And at 11:30 a.m., roughly 2.5 hours after Nancy crashed into the tree, she died. And it was only then, after Nancy was dead, that the medical staff made a discovery, something they had totally missed when Nancy had first came in. And that was, on the back of her head, hidden amongst her hair, was a small circular hole. It was a bullet wound, and for some reason, it didn't bleed at all. Clearly, Nancy did not just randomly veer off the road and smash into a tree. No, she had been shot. About 30 minutes after this discovery was made, a detective named Albert Seidman was standing next to Nancy's crashed car on the side of the highway. Seidman had a reputation as being this totally no-nonsense detective who effectively would stop at nothing to try to solve a case. By this point, he'd already spoken to Nancy's parents, who obviously were devastated and very confused by their daughter's death. They said that, Nancy never got in trouble and certainly didn't have any enemies, and so it made no sense that somebody had just shot her as she was driving. And Detective Seidman had to agree. This was not an average murder case. But regardless, he knew the best place to start this investigation was Nancy's car. The car was actually in pretty good shape. Despite striking this tree at high speeds, the body of the car basically remained intact. And so Seidman began going inside the car and looking all around it, looking for bullet holes to see where this bullet came in and struck the driver. But he found none. Really, there was nothing in the car that gave any information away about what actually happened here. Also, adding to the mystery here is Seidman knew there had been that police lieutenant who just happened to be driving a few cars back from Nancy when she suddenly veered off the road and crashed. And he would say that he did not hear any gunshots, although admittedly he wasn't really listening for gunshots, but he said everything was normal and then the car just veered and crashed. He couldn't understand it. Detective Seidman had briefly considered that, maybe Nancy had been shot by somebody inside of her car. But because of the presence of that lieutenant, who immediately was on the scene and was basically looking at the car from the time it crashed all the way until the ambulance arrived, he said there was nobody else in the car and I did not witness anybody fleeing the scene. The whole situation was very bizarre. But Detective Seidman, thinking logically, thought, okay, well, we know she's been shot. So even though nobody knows how that happened, Well, there has to be a shell casing somewhere for the round that struck her. And so for the rest of the day, Seidman and his team canvassed that whole highway all around that area looking for a shell casing, or really any clue that a gun had been fired in the vicinity. But they found nothing. By the end of the day, Detective Seidman was beginning to feel pretty disappointed about how the investigation was going so far. But he thought to himself, okay, well, I know I haven't found anything promising yet. But remember, she was shot not in some secluded area. She was shot on a major highway in Brooklyn, New York, a city of over 2.5 million people. I mean, someone somewhere must have seen or heard something. And so instead of continuing to look for a shell casing, Seidman abandoned that idea and decided to go find witnesses. Over the next 5 days, Detective Seidman and his team scoured Brooklyn and interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people, looking for anybody who had any information about this shooting. They also put out a public plea for information and were fielding tips that way. But at the end of those 5 days, despite the huge number of interviews, they really hadn't gotten anywhere. As Seidman began to feel his frustration rising, because once again, it just felt like they were hitting another dead end on this case, he told himself, like, they must have missed something. They've talked to a ton of people, but maybe they were too quick. Maybe they weren't asking the right questions. And so on July 12th, he gathered up his team and he circled some spots on a map of Brooklyn and said, look guys, we're gonna go back to these key areas that are sort of positioned in the best angles to have maybe heard or seen something with the shooting. And we're gonna ask some more questions and just see if maybe these people have something we didn't catch. In one of those circled areas, the police discovered a gas station that was owned by a guy named Theodore DeLisi, and it was located only 2 blocks away from where Nancy had been shot. And on the morning of July 12th, when the police officers rolled up to this gas station, Theodore was working and he saw the police coming towards him, and right away he knew this had to be about Nancy McEwen. So Theodore had been following this case really closely as it was developing for 2 reasons. One, Nancy had been shot really close to his gas station, so there's that proximity bias. And 2, Theodore was actually friends with Nancy's father and had known Nancy growing up. And so this case really hit close to home. When the police walked inside the gas station, Theodore immediately asked them, are you here about Nancy? And they would say yes. And that's when he would tell them his connection to Nancy and how he was following this case really closely. But despite his proximity to where she had been shot, he said unfortunately he hadn't seen or heard anything. But then Theodore quickly followed that up and said that, well, while he had been at the gas station in the morning for a little bit, he did take off at some point to go fishing out on the water in his boat, which was not too far away. But even from there too, he still said he didn't hear or see anything. But it was kind of noisy out on the water anyways, so, he really wouldn't have heard anything out there anyhow. The police nodded and asked some simple follow-up questions to Theodore about, take us through what happened that morning, what'd you see, were there other fishermen out there, when you were at the gas station, did you see anything unusual, just kind of seeing if there was anything that would jog his memory. And Theodore was answering every question as truthfully as he could, and at some point, he began to think really hard about what he actually saw when he was out on the water fishing, and suddenly, it all clicked. Theodore knew who killed Nancy. It would turn out at 8:40 a.m. on July 7th, the exact moment Nancy was shot, veered off the road and crashed, Theodore was in fact out in his boat fishing. Except at 8:40 a.m., he wasn't actually fishing. Instead, he had a can, and he threw that can into the water. And once he saw the can, he kind of kept staring at it, and then he raised his rifle and he fired a shot at the can. But he missed, and the bullet, by some fluke of physics, ricocheted off the surface of the water, went up into the highway right as Nancy had rolled her window down, struck her in the head, and killed her. Theodore knew he had been shooting his gun out on the water, but what he saw was the bullet hit the water. He didn't think for a second he could have fired up towards the highway. It was when police began asking questions that he thought, oh my goodness, it is possible. A ricochet could have struck her in the head. Theodore was charged with homicide, but ultimately a grand jury chose not to indict him, citing that this truly was an accident. Theodore did not serve any jail time, but he was fined $100 for firing a rifle within city limits. Hey guys! Did you know you can get your strange, dark, and mysterious fix anytime, anywhere with the Mr. Ballin podcast on Amazon Music? Well, you can. There are tons of stories waiting to be binged right now, plus there are exclusive stories on there that have never been shared on this YouTube channel. Amazon Music listeners get to listen to new episodes an entire month before everybody else. You can also listen to my other show, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, 2 weeks early and totally ad-free on Amazon Music. If you're already a Prime member, well, you already have access to those 2 shows, plus hundreds of other top podcasts ad-free, all at no extra cost. That's right, your Prime membership includes Amazon Music absolutely free. So if you're ready to dive deeper into strange, dark, and mysterious stories, well, go download the Amazon Music app today and listen to the Mr. Ballen podcast and also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. Now, back to today's stories. On the evening of September 17th, 2021, a 42-year-old preacher named Jason Thornburg was cleaning up his motel room in Euless, Texas, which is a small city between Dallas and Fort Worth. Jason was going to be hosting a small Bible study group in his motel room in a few minutes, and even though really it was not that dirty, he was really taking time to ensure it was as clean and inviting as he could possibly make it. So normally, Jason would host these Bible study groups at his house. But unfortunately, Jason's house burned down just that past summer, and he lost everything. But Jason was so committed to God and spreading the word of God that he still wanted to continue having these Bible study groups, even if it meant, doing it in this kind of crummy motel room. And so Jason walked around the room, picking up laundry and straightening up his bed. And then after kind of arranging chairs in a circle for the various participants he was expecting, he went over to a cabinet, pulled out some Bibles, and right as he was about to start placing these Bibles on each chair, he heard a knock at the door. And Jason was really excited because he knew that had to be someone who was here for this Bible study. And so he walked right over, Bibles in hand, to the door. He opened it up, and standing outside the door was this big guy covered in tattoos, kind of looking down at Jason. And Jason broke into a big smile. He was so happy to see this guy. The man's name was David Luaris. And Jason had previously met him when he was out on the street doing outreach for his church, and he had invited David to, anytime he wanted to come by the motel and be a part of this Bible study group. Now, Jason knew that David was really not the kind of guy who went to church or really showed any real interest in God or, the Bible, but, Jason took all kinds, and he was just hopeful that maybe David would show up someday. And now, here David was. However, David told Jason that the reason he was here was actually not for the Bible study group. He was here because he was in the middle of a crisis and he didn't know where else to turn. He confessed to Jason that he had begun using drugs and gotten mixed up in some criminal activity, and there's some dangerous people out there that he was sort of running with, and now his concern was some of those dangerous people were coming to get him. And so he literally felt like his life was in danger. Now, when Jason heard this, he was surprised. But at the same time, he could tell that David was being very authentic and just needed help. And Jason felt like, his job ultimately was to serve God and all of God's people. And David was one of those people, and he was in need of help. And so if all Jason did was simply provided safe haven for David inside of this motel room, then that was serving God, and it was the right thing to do. And so Jason immediately said, "No problem, David." He handed him a Bible and said, "Come on in." David took the Bible awkwardly and just kind of stood there for a moment, not really sure what to do. But then Jason said, "Hey, relax, just come inside, take a seat." And so David did. He walked in, he sat down with the Bible, and then Jason actually came over and sat down next to him, and the two of them, for about 15 minutes, just made kind of awkward small talk. Jason could tell, David is completely on edge. He was staring at the door, which was now closed, and he just clearly was very anxious and paranoid. And so Jason really wasn't talking about the Bible or God or anything. He was just, trying to calm David down and show him that this was a safe place. And then after about 15 minutes of this, when David had somewhat calmed down, and also by this point, nobody else had showed up for this Bible study group, Jason decided, okay, you know what? Maybe I'll just begin the Bible study with David. It kind of gives us something to do. And so Jason got up, he locked the door, showing David that it's just going to be them, it's safe here. And he told David to go ahead and open his Bible to a certain page. And then the two of them just began reading the Bible together. And for hours, they just sat there reading the Bible. And Jason spoke to David about, teachings of God and how to lead your life in a way to serve other people. And, for the most part, David did completely calm down and seemed to really be embracing this Bible study. But eventually, despite how well this Bible study was going, it did need to come to an end at some point, at least in Jason's mind. And when he began to notice it was getting dark outside, he sort of began wrapping it up and he shut his Bible and sort of expected that David would take a hint and leave, but David didn't. Instead, when David began to realize that, hey, this is over now and it's time for you to go, David looked at Jason and begged him to please let him stay in this room overnight, that he can't go out there, it's not safe for him. Now, Jason knew he did have some level of responsibility for David. I mean, David had told him he was in danger, he had already invited him inside and was basically providing safe haven for him, and it did feel kind of wrong to be like, now go back out there, but at the same time, Jason felt a little uneasy. I mean, he didn't really know David. He didn't really understand the situation. And so there was some hesitation at first, but after looking again at David and seeing how desperate he was to just please stay here overnight, Jason said, okay, you can stay. So Jason grabbed some extra blankets and pillows and created a makeshift bed on the floor. And then after that, the two of them actually reopened their Bibles and just began reading some more from the Bible for a couple more hours, basically another round of Bible study. But eventually, they both were very tired, so they put their Bibles down, they said goodnight, they each climbed into their beds, and they closed their eyes and fell asleep. For the next 5 days, Jason's motel room remained mostly closed, and the only thing anybody heard coming from his room was gospel music, and it was being played at a very high volume basically the entire time, to the point where other residents of this motel began to complain about how loud the music was. However, the owner of the motel was getting these complaints from residents who were only there for, hours at a time or days at a time. And, the room they're complaining about, Jason's room, he was a long-term resident and so had a sort of higher priority with the owner. And so the owner just didn't feel like bothering Jason. He wanted him to stay and keep paying for that room. And so the owner didn't do anything about the noise complaints. And also, the owner did know that his motel had sort of a seedy reputation, and so, generally speaking, he didn't really care too much about the music to begin with. And so over the course of these 5 days, the music kept on blasting, and really the only other thing of note, again, that happened in this period of time, was that these two other people entered Jason's motel room and didn't leave either. So basically there's 4 people in the room, they haven't come out again, super loud music, that's all going on for 5 days. And then on the 5th day, the morning of September 22nd, a single person walked out of Jason's motel room, and they were wearing a full-body hazmat suit and carrying some sort of luggage. And they would leave the motel, get in a car, and drive away. 45 minutes later, about 25 miles away from that motel, the Fort Worth Fire Department got a call about this raging dumpster fire in a residential neighborhood. Firefighters quickly got to the scene and put out the blaze, and after it was gone, they walked up to the smoky dumpster and looked inside just to get a look at what was burning, and what they saw caused them all to back up and call the police. It would turn out David was right when he said he was in danger. However, what he didn't understand is hiding out in Jason's motel room was not going to protect him from that danger. Shortly after he and Jason wrapped up that second Bible study that night, and the two of them climbed into their respective beds, Jason in his actual bed and David in the makeshift bed on the floor, well, David did fall asleep pretty quickly, but Jason didn't. Jason waited until David was asleep, and then Jason got up, got a knife, and then slit David's throat. Then he cut David's heart out and ate it, because Jason the preacher really actually believed that human sacrifice was the best and purest way to serve God. Over the course of the next 5 days after killing David, Jason would remain in his motel room blasting gospel music, and over those 5 days, he would basically lure those 2 women into his room, very likely on the promise of Bible study, but they too would be sacrificed. And then on the 5th day, the person who exited the motel room in the full hazmat suit was Jason, and that luggage he was carrying with him contained the body parts of the 3 people he had just killed. And he brought those body parts to that dumpster in that residential neighborhood and lit them on fire. And so when the firefighters put out the fire, what they saw inside were burned up bodies. Jason was arrested, and while he was awaiting trial, he confessed that David and the 2 women were not actually his first victims. He said that just a few years earlier, he had sacrificed his girlfriend, and that house fire that destroyed all of his belongings and prompted him to go live in this motel was set by Jason himself. because he had sacrificed his roommate and needed to get rid of the evidence. Ultimately, law enforcement was only able to show that Jason killed those 5 people. But there could have been more. Jason was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death. He is currently on death row in Texas. On the evening of Thursday, May 21st, 2015, a 16-year-old girl named Lily walked into the home gym inside of her house in Hong Kong looking to do a workout. Now, she sort of expected the gym would be empty and she could kind of have the run of the place, but as soon as she walked in, she saw her dad was in there and he was doing some sort of cool-down exercise on a yoga ball. So Lily's dad, whose name was Ka Kim Sun, was a doctor and a professional, and normally at this time of the day, she would never see him in the gym. He was typically locked upstairs in his study, or upstairs doing work or something, or he was just gone for the day. So for him to be here, it just didn't really line up with his schedule. And so Lily asked her dad, what are you doing here? What's going on? And her dad would tell her, well, actually, work at the hospital was really slow today, so I took off, I played some tennis with friends, and now I'm just doing some cool down exercises because I got nothing else to do. But I'll be out of your hair in a second. And sure enough, a couple of minutes later, her dad was up and out of the gym, and Lily just began her workout. The next day, May 22nd, around 1 o'clock, Lily was at home at her dining room table, sitting across from her mother, whose name was Wong Siu Fing, and Lily was eating a snack and staring at an open textbook. Now, normally at 1 o'clock on a Friday, Lily would be at school, but she had had the day off that day. And she had wanted to spend her day off seeing friends and just being a teenager, but her dad was really focused on her being successful academically, and he told her that absolutely not. You're not going anywhere. You are going to stay home and you are going to study all day long. You will not leave the house. That's what you're doing. So Lily just continued to stare at the textbook and basically do what her father said. And then a couple of minutes later, she actually heard her dad coming down the stairs, and he came into the dining room, and he was clearly very pleased to see his daughter doing her work, or at least appearing to do her work. And he came over to her, gave her a kiss, he kissed their mother, and then he said he was off to work. And then he went out the door, and he was gone. And as soon as Carl was gone, Lily's mom looked over at her and said, I'm not gonna make you study all day. Come on, let's go out and have a mother-daughter shopping day. And Lily was stoked. She shut her textbook, she went and got ready, and then a minute later, she and her mom climbed into her mom's yellow Mini Cooper car, and they headed out. About 2 hours later, around 4:15 p.m., a local jogger was running in the same neighborhood as where Lily and her family lived, and as they were running down the road, they noticed there was this yellow Mini Cooper car sitting on the side of the road, not moving, but it was still on. It was just sort of idling right there. And at first glance, it appeared there were people inside the car, but they weren't doing anything. They were just sitting there, not moving. And so the jogger was curious, and so they ran past and made a point to look inside the car, and they saw 2 women in the front 2 seats of this car slumped over. The 2 women were Lily and her mother. And so the jogger began to panic and banged on the glass to try to get the women to respond, but they didn't. And so a minute later, police were called. They dragged Lily and her mother out of the car. They were totally unresponsive. They were rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. They both died. The police would begin their investigation into their deaths by searching the yellow Mini Cooper car. And when they searched it, there really was nothing of note inside of it. I mean, the 2 women's purses were in the front of the car, there was some basic exercise equipment in the trunk, but the car was pristine, clean, not cluttered. I mean, there really was nothing in the car that gave away what could have happened to these 2 women. For the next 6 months, the police tirelessly looked for some lead as to what happened to this mother and daughter. They would interview all their friends and family. They would search their house top to bottom. They would basically take apart this Mini Cooper and look for, defects or flaws that maybe could have contributed to their death. I mean, they were looking everywhere, but it just didn't make sense. Nobody had any idea what happened to these 2 women. And so right as this case appeared like it was about to go cold, the detectives decided to just go back to the Mini Cooper and see if maybe, just maybe, they missed something. And sure enough, they had. It would turn out on May 22nd, 2015, the day that Lily and her mother died, Lily's father had told Lily to stay home and study, not because he cared about her academics. I mean, he did, but that day, the reason for this was not for that. Instead, he wanted her to stay home all day to protect her. When police originally searched Lily's mom's car, they found the 2 women's purses and also some basic exercise equipment in the trunk. specifically a deflated yoga ball. And at the time, the police didn't think anything of these items. They looked into them, they considered them, but they didn't seem to have any bearing on what happened to the women. However, it would turn out the yoga ball did have something to do with it. Specifically, 2 days before the women were found dead, that yoga ball was inside of Lily's home. It was in her home gym. In fact, when she walked into the home gym and saw her dad doing cool-down exercises and thought it was strange he was home right now, he was using that yoga ball. And Lily didn't think anything of it. But in reality, what her father was doing was not cool-down exercises. He had not just come home early and, had played tennis and this and that. In reality, he had taken that yoga ball to the hospital where he worked and filled it with carbon monoxide, an odorless, colorless, poisonous gas. And his plan was to put the yoga ball in his wife's car, unplug it, and now it's sealed and the gas is going to leak inside the car. And then when his wife got in the car and shut the door, she would effectively suffocate and die. He didn't try to kill his daughter, though. He wanted her to stay home and study, i.e., don't go with your mom and get in the car. But the mother defied the father, brought the daughter along, and then after driving for only a mile, the two women collapsed and died. Ka Kim's son was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. He has never explained his motive. In case you haven't heard yet, our newest graphic novel, Mr. Ballen Presents Where Nightmares Live, is available for pre-order right now. It contains another 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, all based on real events. This was a passion project. It took a lot of time, a lot of people involved, from the artwork to the storytelling. I mean, this is a beautiful piece to add to your collection, so you gotta check it out. The book comes out on September 30th, but again, you can pre-order your copy at book.ballenstudios.com, or you can click the link in the description below. There are a limited number of hand-signed copies available, but those are gonna sell out very quickly. So please pre-order today, because remember, your nightmares are waiting. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
This story is going to be painful to listen to. It's a horrific tragedy, and there's really no other way to tell it without it coming off that way. And so viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please go into the Like Button's favorite music playlist and replace all of the songs with the Kids Bop version of them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications and Reggie fell in love with each other. Every day in the halls, they'd hold hands and they'd laugh with each other and whisper to each other, and then outside of school, they were inseparable. But despite their seemingly perfect relationship, it didn't last long. They both had different ideas about what the future should hold, and so after graduation, they broke up. Reggie went on to join the US Navy, where he served for a number of years all over the world. He would at one point get married, but that marriage would end quickly, and then after he got out of the military, he got a job at a railroad back at his hometown in South Carolina. As for Carol, after graduation, she got married and divorced too, twice actually, but it was her second failed marriage that nearly killed her. On February 18th, 1987, Carol was living with her 10-year-old daughter Rhonda in South Carolina when her estranged second husband came up to the door and knocked. Carol opened the door, and her ex-husband drew a gun and shot her 6 times in front of her daughter before turning around and fleeing. The police would later find his body inside of his car on the side of the road. He had shot himself. As for Carol, the doctors were able to save her life, but the injuries she sustained from the attack were crippling. She was blind in one eye and she had chronic pain, and so her young daughter had to start taking care of her full time. Over the next 8 years, Carol steadily improved and regained some of her independence, But in 1995, she had a huge setback. She started feeling ill, and so she went in to see a doctor, and the doctor did a blood test, and they discovered she had liver cancer. It would turn out the blood that was given to her after the attack, that had been transfused into her body to save her life, it had been tainted with hepatitis C. And so she got hepatitis C without realizing it, and because it had been untreated, it led to liver cancer. Rhonda remembers when her mother came home after being given this terrible news, she just sat down and was silent for a minute, and then she just kind of muttered to herself, I just can't get away from this man. He's killing me all over again. But despite being dealt such an unfair hand in life, Carol was determined to not let her injuries or her illness define her. And so she went out looking for a job that could accommodate her physical limitations, and she found it. She was hired as a part-time customer service rep for a television cable company. She was very happy about this job and very proud of it because it was the first time she was working after the attack, and so for once it felt like her life was going back to normal again. A few years later, in 2000, when Carol was working at the cable company, her phone rang and she answered it the way she answered every other call, but the voice she heard on the other end, she immediately recognized. He introduced himself as Reggie Sumner, and so Carol asked him, are you the Reggie Sumner from 1962 at Garrett High School in South Carolina? And he said, yeah, that's me. And Carol said, I'm your ex-girlfriend. We dated in high school. And so it was this incredible reunion, this totally chance phone call. And for the next hour or so, they just chatted on the phone about everything from their kids to their relationships they've been in to what they're up to now. I mean, they had a lot to catch up on since they hadn't seen or heard from each other in nearly 40 years. And so before they hung up, they realized they lived near each other, and so they made plans to get together in person. Rhonda would say her mother, when she came home that night, was like a 16-year-old girl all over again. She talked endlessly about how great Reggie was and how good-looking he was and how excited she was about their upcoming date. And so a couple of days later, Carol and Reggie have this date, and when Carol comes home, Rhonda would say it was obvious her mother had fallen head over heels in love with Reggie all over again. And luckily, Reggie had fallen in love with Carol too, because less than 6 months later, they got married and became Mr. and Mrs. Sumner. Within a year of their marriage, they decided to sell their home in South Carolina and move to Jacksonville, Florida to retire. Even though caring for her mother for all those years had been quite difficult for Rhonda, she said she was very sad to see her mother go, but at the same time, she was really happy for her because it seemed like she had found the one. Over the next couple of years, Rhonda stayed in touch with her mother, speaking to her almost every single day on the phone. But in July of 2005, Rhonda's mother stopped answering her phone. At first, Rhonda wasn't that concerned, but after 24 hours of not hearing from her mother or from Reggie, she did get concerned. Because even though Reggie was able to care for Carol, he wasn't in the best shape himself. He had debilitating diabetes, and he had recently broken his leg, and so was largely confined to a wheelchair. And so if they were to leave their house for an extended period of time, they wouldn't do it without asking for help from Rhonda. And so over the next couple of days, Rhonda incessantly called her mother and called Reggie, but she never got through to them. And so finally, after almost 72 hours of not hearing from them, she decides to just hop in her car and drive the 4 hours to Jacksonville to check on them personally. When she got there, she saw her mother and Reggie's car was not in the driveway like it normally would be. And so Rhonda went up to the front door and she knocked and she's yelling for her mom, but nobody's coming to the door, even though lights are on inside the house. And so Rhonda eventually tries the handle of the door and it's open. And so she opens it up, she steps inside, she yells again for her mom and for Reggie, but no one yells back. And then she sees their beloved dog, Mikey, that they brought everywhere with them, was still in the house. And so she's thinking, where would they have gone without bringing Mikey? And so Rhonda continues to walk through the house into the kitchen. And when she gets there, she sees on the table are 2 plates of food where the food looks like it's a couple of days old and it's just sitting on the plate like they had been eating it and then just abandoned it there. And then in the sink are all these dirty dishes. And then on the stove are half-cooked pots of food. And Rhonda knows her mother is an extremely tidy person and she never would have left her house with dirty dishes and food out on the table. And so red flags are going up for Rhonda. But what ultimately sealed the deal for her was when she turned and looked on one of the counters, she saw the cell phone that Reggie and Carol shared was still sitting there along with Carol's purse. And then next to that was both of their medications, which was Reggie's insulin and Carol's liver cancer medication, both of which were life-saving and needed to be taken every single day. There's no way they would have left the house without those things. And so Rhonda immediately calls the Jacksonville Police Department and she files a missing person report. And before long, the missing couple's story story is all over the news, and all of the networks are asking people if they have information to come forward. But no one came forward, and so the only lead the police had was to track down the Sumners' car, which was missing from their driveway when Rhonda showed up at their house. So the police shared the description of their vehicle all across the state, and very quickly they got a hit. The car had been found abandoned in a Florida town about 1 hour west of Jacksonville. It had been parked in this semi-forested, very secluded area off of a dirt road, and there was nothing inside of it, but they saw the battery had been taken out, leading some of the officers to speculate that perhaps the Sumners really had just driven away from their home without telling anybody and then ran into car troubles. But that theory would quickly be thrown out the window when 5 hours later, the Jacksonville police received a very strange phone call. The man who called in said he was Reggie Sumner, and he said he had seen the news about him and his wife being missing and that was just totally not true, that in reality they had left, but they were just fine and they'd be back soon. The police are immediately suspicious of this person. They don't think it's Reggie Sumner because, for one, he sounds like a young man and Reggie is a 61-year-old, and so the voice didn't really line up, and just the way he was talking about this disappearance like it was no big deal, that also just didn't really make sense. And so one of the officers asked Reggie, "Are you with your wife Carol?" And he said, "Yep, I'm with her, here she is." And so a woman hops on the phone who says she's Carol Sumner, but she sounds far too young to be Carol Sumner, who's 61. This sounds like a 18, 19, 20-year-old girl, and she too just reiterates that everything's just fine and they've gone out for a couple of days, there's nothing to worry about, and you police can stop looking for us. And so after this call ends, the police at this point are convinced that this simply cannot be Carol and Reggie. But to make sure, they call in Rhonda and they have her listen to the recording of this conversation with the so-called Reggie and Carol, and right away Rhonda says, "That's not my mom and that's not Reggie." And so at this point, the police assumed that these two people who called in pretending to be the Sumners probably had something to do with the disappearance of the real Sumners. And so while they waited for the trace on this phone call to come back, which would give them information about who was calling and from where, the police decided to investigate another angle. The police looked at the Sumners' bank statements and they saw their bank card had been used at an ATM in South Carolina after the Sumners had been reported missing. And so they called that bank and they asked for the CCTV footage from that ATM. And when they watched it, they saw that it was not Carol or Reggie Sumner withdrawing funds. It was some unknown man in his early 20s. Right after this discovery of this unknown man, the trace from the phone conversation with the imposter Sumners came back, except it was tied to a fake name at a fake address. So that wasn't helpful to the police in their investigation. However, when they went through this cell phone's call logs, which they got with the phone trace, they saw whoever owned the cell phone had recently placed a call to a car rental company in South Carolina. And so the police call this car rental company and they speak to the manager and they're able to figure out that somebody using this cell phone number had indeed called and had rented a car, and the car they rented matched the description of the car the unknown man was driving in the ATM surveillance footage. But this car had been rented to a woman. Her name was Tiffany Cole. The rental company told police that all of their cars had satellite tracking information built into them. And so police were able to use that information to track Tiffany's rental car to a motel in South Carolina. The initial thought was that maybe the Sumners are being held against their will in this motel. And so very quickly, a police force was organized, and on the morning of July 14th, so 6 days after the Sumners were listed as missing, they arrive at this motel. They go to the front desk, they find out what room Tiffany is in, they get the key, and they go up and they open the door. The Sumners were not inside. Instead, there were 3 young adults sitting there. It was 24-year-old Tiffany Cole, her boyfriend, 23-year-old Michael James Jackson, and his friend, 19-year-old Alan Wade. Also in the room were dozens of bags of recently purchased merchandise, like computers and video games and clothes and perfume, and also they discovered the key to the Sumners' vehicle and Reggie Sumner's prized coin collection. The police brought all 3 back to the police station and put them in separate rooms to be interrogated. At this point, it was obvious to police that these 3 had something to do with the Sumners' disappearance. They had all these things in the room that tied them to the missing couple. And so now the police, as they interrogated them, it was not so much about connecting them to the Sumners as much as it was about helping them find the Sumners. At first, all 3 of them either didn't talk or were totally uncooperative. But under intense questioning, Tiffany cracked a little bit. She said that they had robbed the Sumners, but nothing more. They didn't do anything else besides rob them. And there had been a fourth person involved in the robbery, 19-year-old Bruce Nixon, who was friends with Alan Wade. Bruce lived nearby, so the police quickly rounded him up and brought him in for questioning, and unlike the other three, Bruce immediately caved. And the story he told about what happened to the Sumners brought many of the police that were involved in this investigation to tears. He said it all started with Tiffany. Tiffany used to be neighbors with the Sumners back when they still lived in South Carolina. Tiffany had a pretty rough upbringing and her father was permanently sick. And so the Sumners kind of took her under their wing and looked after her and built a very close relationship with her and kind of treated her like she was one of their daughters. Anything she needed, if she needed money, food, anything, they would give it to her. For example, in 2001, right before they left for Florida, they sold a car to Tiffany, but they sold it for basically nothing because they knew she didn't have any money and she really needed a car. 4 years later, in June of 2005, Tiffany was partying in Jacksonville, Florida with her new boyfriend, Michael James Jackson, when they got kicked out of the house they planned on staying in for the night. And so now they don't have a place to stay, they don't have any money, and that's when Tiffany remembers the Sumners had moved to Jacksonville and they would always help her out if she needed anything. And so the two of them drive to the Sumners' house in the middle of the night, they haven't called them, and they just knock on the door, totally uninvited, and Carol comes to the door, and when she opens it, she sees Tiffany, and immediately she's like, "Oh my goodness, I haven't seen you in so long. Come in, come in. Who are you? Oh, Michael, great to meet you. Come on inside. I'll get you food. We'll get you fed. What do you need? What can we do for you?" And so that's when Tiffany explains to them that their plans had kind of fallen through and they didn't have a place to stay that night, and would it be possible to stay with them? And so Carol and Reggie right away say, "Absolutely no problem. Tiffany, Michael, you guys are guests here. You're welcome. Stay as long as you want." And so that night, Carol cooked a big meal for them and they all sat down at the table. And at some point, Carol and Reggie talk about the sale of their house in South Carolina. And somehow it came up that they had made $99,000 in profit from this sale. And they were so happy about it because now they could really retire comfortably. And so as soon as they said that, Tiffany and Michael shot glances at each other because they knew they had to come back and rob them. The next morning, Carol and Reggie got up early, they made coffee and they made breakfast, and they were hoping that Tiffany and Michael would stick around for the day and spend some more time with them. But Tiffany and Michael were very quick to want to leave. They said, "Thank you very much, we got to hit the road." And so they left. And as soon as they get in the car, they start planning how they're going to come back and rob the Sumners and get their hands on that $99,000. 1 month later, on the evening of July 8th, after all robbery preparations have been made, Bruce Nixon and Alan Wade show up at the Sumner house and they knock on the door. When the door opens, it's Carol, and she doesn't recognize either of them, but being as kind and generous as she was, she said, "Hey boys, what can I do for you? How can I help you?" And this was exactly what Bruce and Alan were expecting based on what Tiffany told them. She said this couple would be very easy to exploit. And they tell her that their car had broken down and they needed to use her phone. And so she's a little bit skeptical, but ultimately she says, "Sure, come on in." And so Bruce and Alan go inside the house, the door shuts behind them, and as soon as it does, one of them draws a fake gun that looks very real and pointed it at Carol, while the other one began tying her up with cord and with duct tape. And so Carol begins screaming and making a bunch of noise, and Reggie, who's in the garage out of sight, he hears her. He comes running in to see what's going on, and he sees these two men who immediately attack him, and Reggie's got a broken leg and he's already pretty weak and frail, and so he doesn't put up much of a fight. And before long, he and his wife were all taped up and restrained on the couch, and they were having duct tape wrapped around their heads until everything was covered except for a slit underneath their nose so they could breathe. And so with the couple completely under control and at the mercy of their captors, one of the men texted Michael, who was down the road with Tiffany inside of Tiffany's rental car, and the text just said, "All clear." And what that meant was Michael could now come up and help them rob the house. And so Tiffany stays down the road in the rental car. Michael makes his way up. He goes inside, and he, Bruce, and Alan proceeded to ransack the house. And while these three men are moving room to room, taking all of their valuables, Reggie and Carol are probably thinking to themselves that, what? This is awful. We're getting robbed. But after they take whatever they take and they leave, we'll be fine. We'll recover. But when these three men finish taking all of their valuable items, they decided that they would also take Reggie and Carol. So they stood the couple up and they marched them into the garage and they put them in the trunk of their own car. At this point, Bruce left the Sumners' house and went down the road and got in Tiffany's rental car, and Michael and Alan, they got into the Sumners' car, and the two cars met up on the road and then drove 40 minutes northwest just over the border into Georgia, where they found this access road and they went down it until they reached this very secluded section of forest. This was not just some random spot in the middle of the woods in Georgia. This was a pre-selected spot that Tiffany and the others had been out to 2 days earlier to prepare it. And what they had done to prepare was to dig a grave for the Sumners. Michael and Alan in the Sumners' car drove up right next to the grave site while Tiffany and Bruce came up right behind them. And once they'd all stopped, they got out of the car and they went right behind the Sumners' car and they popped open the trunk. It's believed the temperature inside of that trunk was well over 100 degrees. And so Reggie and Carol were sweating profusely, and the sweat had caused their restraints to slip off their wrists and slip down off their face. And so the two of them were found holding on to each other and crying and praying. Seeing how weak they already were, the group decided they did not need to put new tape around their wrists or their face. They weren't going to go anywhere. And so they grabbed the two and they pulled them out and dumped them on the ground. It was probably around this time that the Sumners realized Tiffany was one of these 4 people that was doing this horrible thing to them. And I can only imagine the heartbreak they experienced. This girl that they took in under their wing, that they thought of as a daughter, was betraying them in such a heinous and horrible way. But there was no time to feel upset about it, because as soon as they were dumped on the ground, Michael grabbed Reggie and kind of threw him over to the side and said, "Sit down, don't move, or I'm going to kill you and your wife." And then the others grabbed Carol and dragged her away from her husband over to the edge of the grave, where they literally ripped the jewelry off of her face and off of her body. And then after all the jewelry was gone, they pushed her into the grave. Then they walked over to Reggie and dragged him over and threw him in with his wife. As soon as the couple was in the grave together, they repositioned themselves so they were both sitting up, one in front of the other, with Carol behind Reggie, and she threw her legs and her arms around Reggie, just kind of clutching onto him, and she buried her head into his back and she began crying. The original plan, apparently, had been to take the Sumners and put them in this grave and pretend like you were going to do something to them, to scare them into giving up all of their information, all of their banking information, and anything else that was valuable. And it worked. And so as Carol is crying into Reggie's back, Reggie is pleading with the group. He's pleading to them, "Let me give you everything I have. Whatever you need, it's yours." And so Michael said, "Give me all your ATM bank card numbers, give me your PIN numbers, everything." And so Reggie did. He gave him all the information he could possibly give to him. And then, for some reason, despite the fact that at this point, the group has taken everything of value from this poor couple, they have extracted all the valuable information they could possibly get from them. Despite that, they decide that that's not enough. They need to kill the Sumners. And they need to kill them in the worst way imaginable. They need to bury them alive. For hours, the group slowly, shovelful by shovelful, filled in this hole with Reggie and Carol sitting at the bottom begging for their lives. But the group didn't care at all. They just kept shoveling dirt down on top of them until the dirt and mud had gotten up to their necks, and the weight of the dirt was pressing in on their chests and was making it really hard to breathe. And so as Carol and Reggie are feeling this happening to them, they can feel themselves being crushed under this weight. Their cries for help become more and more desperate, but more spaced apart, because their breathing at this point is so labored, it's so hard to get a full breath that they're conserving their air at this point. And then at some point, as the dirt crept closer and closer to their mouths, they had to tilt their heads up to try to get a good breath of air. But when they did that, they began shoveling dirt directly onto their faces, causing them to choke and gag. They're inhaling this, and it's becoming nearly impossible to catch a breath. They're dying at this point. And so finally, another layer of dirt was thrown on top of them and they disappeared under the soil. But their sounds didn't go away. They continued to whimper and make sounds as more and more dirt was put down, until finally they had filled in the hole and they began packing the dirt down with the backs of their shovels. And they could hear underneath the soil still the sounds of this couple dying. This was a slow and horrible death. After the killers were done, they left the site and they took the Sumner's car and they dumped it in Florida where it was ultimately found. And then they all piled into the rental car. They went to an ATM and pulled some of the Sumner's money out and then went on a spending spree. Here is a photo of Tiffany celebrating just hours after killing the very people that had taken her in and treated her like a daughter. After their autopsies, the medical examiner explained that both Reggie and Carol had dirt packed into their nose, into their mouths, in their throats, in their stomach, and in their lungs, meaning their actual cause of death was being buried alive. In exchange for telling investigators what happened and for leading them to the gravesite where the Sumners were, Bruce Nixon was spared the death penalty and given a life sentence. As for Michael, Allen, and Tiffany, they were all sentenced to death. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please go into the like button's favorite music playlist and replace all of the songs with the Kids Bop versions of them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.
Today, we're going to cover 2 very strange but very true stories. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to go skydiving with you, but replace their parachute with an anvil. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any. One afternoon in the spring of 1990, a young mother tidied up her family's living room in Pingyang Township, which is a small rural community made up of several villages in southern China. And she was almost done when she heard her 3-year-old twin daughters start to cry. And this really caught her off guard, because even though these kids were only 3 years old and 3-year-olds cry, well, her daughters basically never cried. They were like silent all the time. The girls' names were Shi Tsai and Shi Hongwu. And they'd been really easy babies because they were basically quiet all the time and just wanted to sleep. However, as they got older, their silence became more concerning. All they really wanted to do was just lay around and sleep and do nothing. Even at 3 years old, they hadn't even said their first words yet. So when this mom heard these girls crying, she rushed down the hall to see what was going on. 1, just obviously to make sure her kids were okay, but 2, just out of curiosity. This is so uncharacteristic to be making any noise at all. And so the mom, she burst into the nursery and she saw her girls in their crib and they were sobbing hysterically, totally upset. And the mother rushed over and she scooped them up and asked, what's going on? Are you okay? But of course the girls didn't say anything because they didn't speak. They just continued to cry. But the mom, she kind of assessed her kids and couldn't see any injuries. They didn't seem sick. They were just upset about something, but she had no idea what it was. And so the mom just stood there comforting her girls until they calmed down, and then she put them back into the crib and they both went to sleep. And that was it. A couple of days later, and the twin girls were back to their normal routine, being totally silent and sleeping for most of the day. And as the girls slept in their nursery, their mom just went around the house doing some housework, and at some point, she walked down the hallway past the girls' bedroom. Now, their door to the nursery was shut, and again, they're just sleeping and being totally quiet. The mom hasn't heard them at all day. And as she's walking down the hallway, she suddenly comes to an abrupt stop right outside the nursery door, because distinctly, she can hear her girls making noise in their room. But they're making a noise that just doesn't make any sense to the mother. Her daughters were not crying or fussing or anything like that. They were talking. At first, the mother wanted to rush in there and experience this firsthand, this landmark moment of her girls speaking for the first time. But she also worried if she went in there, they might go silent and she'd ruin the moment. And so instead, she just pressed her ear to the door and just listened. And as she listened, she really couldn't believe what she was hearing. Because these girls weren't just babbling, saying random words. These girls were having like a full-blown conversation with each other, like adult-level sentences being spoken back and forth. These girls who apparently, at least according to the mother, couldn't even speak. Like, how is this even happening? However, the more the mother listened to her daughters, the more unsettled she became. Not only because, she's listening to her daughters speak for the first time at like an adult level, which is totally bizarre, but the content of this discussion her 3-year-old daughters are having made no sense. These girls were talking about stuff that they could not possibly know. The girls were talking in detail about people and events from a totally different village. A village their mother knew they had never been to, had never even heard of, and certainly didn't know anybody who lived there. Now, in basically every other part of the world, if a mother suddenly heard her 3-year-old twins, who had never said a word before, suddenly having adult-level conversations with each other about people and places that they can't possibly know about, that might be enough to spurn that mother to at least call their doctor. But this mom? Well, she lived in Pingyang Township. And that meant, when she heard what her daughters were saying, as alarming as it was, she actually did know what was going on. Pingyang Township has a very strange secret. And that secret is that of the approximately 7,000 residents who live there, over 100 claim to be the reincarnated spirits of people who have died traumatic deaths. And this is not just some wacky thing these people are saying. No, in Pingyang Township, it's not just those 100 people who believe they really are reincarnated. It's the whole community. All 7,000 some odd people 100% believe that these people truly are reincarnated. And so how that plays out is that periodically, the reincarnated folks will go to a non-reincarnated person in the township and will claim things like, hey, in my past life, your family owed me a debt. And so now you're going to pay it out. And these non-reincarnated people will absolutely pay that debt. Or in other cases, there have been fights, physical altercations that have come from a reincarnated person approaching a non-reincarnated person and basically saying, in a previous life, you or your family or your relatives insulted me in some capacity, my previous self, and we're going to fight about it right now. And those fights take place in this town, and it's totally normal. But the interactions between the reincarnated and non-reincarnated people in this township, it's not just about conflict. In fact, there's been lots of decisions made in this township that are designed very specifically to avoid conflict between the reincarnated and non-reincarnated. For example, there was a little boy who claimed to be the reincarnated spirit of a pig who was butchered in town, and the butcher, who this boy said butchered him when he was a pig, well, the butcher, to make sure he was not offending this boy or potentially other people who were, the reincarnated spirits of other animals he had slaughtered, the butcher shut down his business just to be like, I don't want to offend you all. I'll find something else to do with my life. And so when this mother heard the sound of her twin girls who had never spoke before, suddenly having this detailed conversation about people and events from this other village, as jarring and shocking as that was for her, because she lives in Pingyang, she instantly understood that the only way my girls could have that information and be able to have this conversation is if they are reincarnated spirits. And so this mother did what she thought was right, which was not to call a doctor, but instead to get the word out to the people not just in her village, but across the Pingyang Township that her twin daughters are actually reincarnated spirits. The mother's hope was that perhaps there was still family of these reincarnated spirits in this other village her daughters were referencing in their conversation that would find out about this, and maybe they'd want to come here and meet their family who now live inside of her daughters. And sure enough, less than a week after this mother got the word out, this man and woman who she didn't know came knocking at her door. When the mother let them inside the house, her girls immediately recognized them. One of the twins said that this was her mother and father from her previous life. Then the twins, these little 3-year-old girls, went on to tell this unbelievably complicated and sophisticated story about how in their previous life, these twin girls were not actually sisters. Instead, they were best friends, and together, they had taken their own lives approximately 1 month before they were reborn in the bodies of these twin girls. And so after that, the twins just continued talking to this man and woman for quite some time, giving specific details about this village that, again, these girls, at least according to their mother, had never been to before. These girls also gave intimate details about these teenage girls' lives and even had information that was very specific to what happened to them when they took their lives and, where their bodies were found. Again, information these girls shouldn't have. And then at some point, the mother of the twins asked this man and woman, like, are these details they're giving you accurate? Is this true? And the man and woman said, yep, it's all true. And then at some point, the twins turned to their biological mother and they told her that the reason they had been silent to this point was because they were trying to keep their reincarnation a secret. And also, the reason they slept all the time is because when they slept, they would dream about their previous lives, which they claimed to miss. To this day, no one's ever been able to offer a better explanation for how these twin girls, these toddlers, had such accurate information about people they had never met and places they'd never been to. Basically, the only explanation that works is that they must actually be the reincarnated spirits of those teenage girls. Pingyang Township remains a hotspot of alleged reincarnations, and nobody knows why. As many of you may already know, we launched the MrBallen's podcast 3 years ago on Valentine's Day 2022. Now, it was totally unintentional to launch the show on Valentine's Day, but after doing that, we decided to kind of make it an annual event that every Valentine's Day, we not only celebrate our love for our partners and families and friends, but also our love for the strange, dark, and mysterious. And so to celebrate this year's Valentine's Day, you see what we did there? We are going to host our very first live show of the year, and it will be totally free right here on YouTube. All you have to do is click the link in the description, and that will bring you right on over to the scheduled live show so that you can set a reminder and get a front row seat. Valentine's Day is on Friday, February 14th, and the live show starts at 1 p.m. Eastern. Again, it's going to happen right here on YouTube for free, so go ahead and click that link and enjoy the show. Okay, so this next story is going to sound really far-fetched once it gets going, but stick with it because at the end, there is a crazy plot twist. Like, this is one of the better stories we found in some time, so stick around till the end. On a spring afternoon in 1883, a young woman named Sarah tidied up her farmhouse in a tiny settlement called Eagle Creek in Arizona. While Sarah cleaned, her sister Elizabeth took a bucket outside to get water from their outdoor spring. So Sarah and Elizabeth actually lived together in this farmhouse along with their respective families. The American West at this time was sparsely populated and dangerous, so it was not uncommon for families to kind of band together like this. Their husbands herded the sheep and worked the land, while Sarah and Elizabeth looked after the house and also took care of their collective 4 kids. And so on this day, as Elizabeth was out getting water, Sarah continued to tidy up the house with one eye on the kids, making sure they were okay, when all of a sudden, the family's dogs, who were leashed up outside, began barking really aggressively. Now, for Sarah, this was really alarming because the dogs typically were pretty docile and didn't make a lot of noise. So clearly, something was going on outside. And so Sarah told the kids to stay inside, and she quickly went outside onto the porch to see what the dogs were barking at. And so once Sarah was out on that porch, she immediately surveyed the area out in front of her, and off to her left and off to her right was just rocky scrubland, and then right in front of their house was this big sandy hill that kind of obscured their view off into the distance. And the dogs, who were leashed up right in front of the property out in the front yard, they were all looking right at that hill and barking at it. At first, Sarah couldn't understand what the dogs were even barking at. I mean, she looked around a few more times to see if she was missing anything, but there was nothing happening out here. But then, as Sarah continued to stare at this hill where the dogs were still barking, she suddenly saw this huge creature emerge over the top and begin coming down the hill in her direction. It was this massive 4-legged creature with red fur, and its back was all twisted up. And on the back of this creature was this man. Except it was not a normal-looking man. His face was horrible and sunken, and his mouth was in this huge grin. And as she stared at him in total shock and disbelief, she saw he was missing eyes. Now, Sarah was a deeply religious person, And so as she's watching this creature being ridden on by this person come charging towards her, all she could think was, this is the devil. The devil is riding on this red creature and it's coming to get me and my family. And so instinctively, she just turned, bolted inside the house, barricaded the door with the kitchen table, and then rounded up the 4 kids and sat in the kitchen, huddled over them, praying to God to save them from the devil. But as she was doing this, Sarah suddenly heard this blood-curdling scream come from somewhere outside. And she knew it sounded way too human of a scream to be coming from the devil or the creature it was riding on. And then she remembered her sister was out there getting water. That scream almost certainly came from her sister. But Sarah was so scared, she couldn't move. And she had these 4 kids to look after. And so instead of going out to try to save her sister, she just held the kids closer and continued to pray, hoping her sister would survive. Hours later, Sarah was still inside the barricaded house, clutching the children, praying, and her sister Elizabeth had not made another sound, and she had not come back to the house. So she's been gone for hours at this point. And Sarah feels horrible. All she wants to do is go out there and find her sister, but she just feels like she can't leave her kids, and she knows the devil is out there, so she can't go out there. But just then, she hears footsteps out on the porch, and then she hears the sound of the doorknob turning and then bumping up against the barricade, and Sarah immediately thinks it's the devil. The devil's come back, and so she screams, and the kids are screaming. But then, on the other side of the door, Sarah hears the sound of 2 familiar voices. It was the sound of her and Elizabeth's husbands. They had come back from herding the sheep and they're calling into her like, hey, what's going on here? Let us in. And so this huge wave of relief came over Sarah. She rushed to the door, she got rid of the barricade, flung it open, and immediately began sobbing and telling these men about what had happened, about the devil, about hearing that scream, which she believed was Elizabeth. And oh, by the way, Elizabeth is still not back yet. No idea what happened to her. And so the 2 husbands are immediately so concerned. They have no idea about the validity of the story, but Elizabeth is gone. They have to go find her. And so the 2 men, they grab their guns and lanterns and they head off towards the outdoor spring to hopefully find Elizabeth. And so the 2 men, they begin making their way down this path towards the spring. And at first they were walking, kind of keeping their composure, but quickly as they're calling out for Elizabeth and not getting a response, they just took off running. And as they turned the corner and they finally saw the spring, they also saw Elizabeth. And she was face down on the ground with blood all around her. She was dead. And so as Elizabeth's husband wept over Elizabeth's body, Sarah's husband rode off into town to get the local coroner to come out and investigate to see what happened to Elizabeth. The only thing that seemed fairly obvious about Elizabeth's death, at least to the 2 husbands, was that Elizabeth looked like she had been trampled to death. There were all these hoof prints all around her when they found her. And so the coroner, he comes out and he looks at the scene, he sees Elizabeth, and he agrees that it looks like she was trampled to death. However, when he examined the hoof prints that were all over the place, they were way too big to be a horse's hoof print. And so the coroner literally said, I can't say she died by being trampled by a horse. This was not a horse. And so the coroner wound up speaking to Sarah, who would tell him all about, how the devil came over the hill on this big 4-legged creature that was all red. And she heard the scream, which must have been Elizabeth. And so the devil has trampled her sister to death. That's what happened. Now, the coroner agreed with Sarah that very likely her sister had been trampled to death by something gigantic. However, he didn't believe the actual details of Sarah's story. He did not believe that the devil killed Elizabeth. And so ultimately, because the coroner just couldn't be sure what actually happened to her, he wound up listing Elizabeth's cause of death as just unknown. But the coroner's doubts did not stop the story of the devil from spreading. Before long, basically everybody on the Arizona frontier had heard about the devil and the strange creature he rode, to the point where they were given a nickname. Together, they were called the Red Ghost. Still, most people who heard this story didn't really believe it actually happened. They figured it was kind of a joke or maybe an exaggeration, just sort of lore passed around town. But over the next few years following Elizabeth's death, sightings of the so-called Red Ghost became much more frequent and more strange. Many campers claim to have seen the Red Ghost trotting through the Arizona wilderness. In fact, some of these people claim that in the middle of the night, the Red Ghost would appear and trample on their tents. One cowboy claimed he got close enough to the Red Ghost that he was able to actually lasso its neck. However, the red ghost, in turn, took off so quickly and so powerfully that the cowboy got dragged and had to let go. And so stories like these, run-ins with the red ghost out in the wild, persisted for years, until about a decade after Elizabeth's death, this farmer in eastern Arizona happened to look out his window, and there, standing in his turnip patch, was the so-called red ghost. And this farmer had heard all the stories about the red ghost, and he had already made up his mind about what he would do if he ever ran into the red ghost, and that would be to shoot it. And so what did he do? He grabbed his rifle, he leaned out the window, and he fired. And the red ghost crumpled to the ground right in the middle of the turnip patch. Once the creature was down, the farmer rushed outside and ran up to the carcass to finally see what the heck the red ghost was, what was causing all these stories to spread over so many years. And when he got out there and actually looked down at the red ghost, he knew immediately that all the stories about this creature had been wrong. It would turn out the red ghost was not the devil riding some supernatural monster. Instead, the red ghost was a combination of two very mortal beings. The first of these two beings was a creature that, if you saw it today, you would know what it was. But for folks in Arizona in the late 1800s, they would have no way of knowing what this creature was. They had never seen it before. It had red fur, a long neck, and a humped back. It was a camel. It had been brought to the United States from the Mediterranean to help haul supplies through the western frontier, and it had escaped captivity. But this camel alone was not responsible for scaring the people of Arizona. What terrified the people of Arizona and created the legend of the red ghost was the rider of the camel. When Sarah saw the rider on the camel, at first she thought it was a person. But when she looked more closely, she saw they didn't have eyes and they had this disgusting toothy grin. They just couldn't be human to her. And so she had decided this must be the devil. But it would turn out her first instinct was right. This was a person. There was a person on the back of that camel. The devil on the back of the camel was a man's decomposing corpse. And because he was a decomposing corpse, his flesh and eyes had rotted from his face, making it look like he had no eyes and gave him this huge toothy grin because there was no flesh there. Now, we don't know who this man was or how exactly he died. All we know is at some point he was riding this camel escaped, he died and somehow didn't fall off, and his dead body remained in an upright seated position on this camel. And then this camel just roamed around Arizona for years with this corpse on its back, giving the impression that it was the devil riding on a monster. Today, the red ghost remains a local legend in Arizona. In fact, there's even a permanent statue of the camel in a small Arizona town called Quartzsite. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments what you thought of today's episode, and also remember, we have hundreds more videos for you to binge right now. But if you want a recommendation of, which video to invest your time in, well, here are two great options right here. If you want more Mr. Ballin content, click on this one. And if you want some redacted declassified mysteries with Luke LaManna, click over here. All right, until next time, see ya. All right, so I am back in front of a literal fire because you guys loved the last fire episode that we did, the last campfire episode. And on today's campfire episode, I have a great ghost story. Not only is the story itself super creepy, but I'm telling you, the plot twist at the very end, worth sticking around for. You gotta listen. It's a great story. I know you're gonna love it. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right fire pit, because that's all we do. And we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to come join you at a nice, cozy campfire. But as soon as they sit down and they get their s'mores ready, just immediately get a fire extinguisher out and put out the fire. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't One afternoon in the winter of 2015, a 57-year-old woman named Patricia Dare was sleeping on her couch inside of her home in France when the sound of her phone dinging woke her up. Patricia slowly opened her eyes and she felt groggy and confused.
She'd been relaxing and watching a movie since she had the day off from her job as a reporter for a local radio station, but she realized, she must have dozed off. And so Patricia, she grabbed her phone and she checked her notifications, and she saw she had a text message, but from a number that she didn't recognize. And what it said was really weird. It said, quote, "The castle wants you. The castle is calling you. Come." And for a second, Patricia just had no idea what this meant. Couldn't make sense of what this even said. But then she realized there was actually text messages that she had received earlier from this number, and she realized who it was. So the person texting Patricia this strange message was this middle-aged woman named Béranger. About 8 months earlier, Béranger had approached Patricia while she was out in public and told her that she desperately needed Patricia's help. Because, Béranger said, she worked in a castle, and that castle was haunted. So Patricia, in addition to being a local news reporter, was also a self-proclaimed psychic medium, meaning she basically believed that she had the ability to contact the dead. That was something she was really passionate about. And in fact, she was fairly famous for being a psychic medium in France. So, this request was actually not that bizarre for Patricia. But because of Patricia's status, both because she was, a famous medium and also because she was on the news, she was sort of well known, and it drew a lot of people to her, claiming that they had, paranormal issues ranging from, thinking they saw a ghost to their house is haunted or whatever. And almost all the time when Patricia would follow up with some people who claimed they had issues, she would discover that, despite her best efforts, there clearly was nothing going on that was paranormal. There was no dead to talk to. It was just like, drafty windows or a house settling or, just a shadow that looked really eerie or something. So the vast majority of times people approached Patricia, she really didn't take them that seriously. So a couple of months ago, when Béranger had approached Patricia, her reaction to it was basically like, "Oh, your castle's haunted." Yeah, I bet, but she was polite about it, but realistically, she didn't believe it was true. But because Béranger was sort of persistent, really demanding help from Patricia, Patricia did give her her phone number sort of to be polite. And then immediately afterwards, Béranger had texted Patricia, and those were the text messages that Patricia had, in the thread, but Patricia had intentionally ignored them. But now, here was Béranger texting her once again with this sort of weird cryptic message, again about this haunting of her castle. And this actually kind of piqued Patricia's interest. And because Patricia did have a day off here, she actually felt inspired to follow up and maybe go check out this castle and see what this haunting was all about. An hour and a half later, Patricia pulled up in front of this small cottage that was on the same property as the castle. She knew from earlier text messages that this cottage was where Béranger actually lived. And so Patricia parked, she got out, she walked up to the front door of the cottage, and she knocked. But nobody answered. And so after a few moments, she tried knocking again, this time a little bit louder, and then the door did open. But it was not Béranger. It was this man, this middle-aged man who looked very confused to be seeing Patricia standing there. And just from the look on his face, Patricia immediately launched into this, explanation of why she was here. "Oh, is Béranger here? I was speaking to her via text message." And the man still, he's looking at her like, "What are you doing here? What's going on?" But then from behind him, out walks Béranger. And when she looked towards the door and she saw Patricia standing there, Béranger was practically weeping. I mean, she was so happy and clearly relieved to see Patricia, and she's just like, "Oh my gosh, thank you so much for coming. This is unbelievable. Thank you. Like, we really need your help." And then before Patricia could ask any questions, Béranger pointed to the man that had opened the door for Patricia and seemed so confused. And, at this point, his expression had softened quite a bit. And Béranger said, "This is my husband. This is Remy. And he, too, is so relieved you're here." And so at this point, Patricia, she shook his hand and she smiled at them both and was like, "Yeah, I don't know what I can do for you. Why don't you fill me in? All I know is apparently your castle over there is haunted. Can you tell me the story?" And so Béranger, she had to kind of compose herself because she was quite emotional just to see Patricia here. But, after collecting herself, she told Patricia that about a year ago, her husband, Remy, had been hired as the caretaker of that castle, and that she had just come along to help. And she said, at first, both of them had been really excited for this opportunity because it came with free housing in this cottage. However, Béranger said that they had only been working here for a couple of weeks when really weird stuff started to happen. Béranger said that she'd be in the castle doing, daily chores, and she would know that she's the only one in the castle. Yet she would suddenly hear what were obvious footsteps of people walking and running around on the upper floors of the castle. And at this point, Remy chimed in and he said, yeah, me too. Like, I've heard those footsteps in the castle when I know it's totally empty. But even stranger than that is Remy said he'd be in the castle and he would hear voices. And not just, people whispering or something like you see in the movies. No, he would hear people screaming at the top of their lungs, like in other distant parts of the castle that he couldn't see. And it was terrifying. As Patricia listened to Remy and Béranger tell this story, Patricia was struck by how earnestly they came across. I mean, they definitely were shaken by whatever they experienced inside of that castle. Like, they were genuinely troubled and didn't know what to do about it. I mean, Remy still had this job at the castle. They still had to go in there, but it was becoming like this big issue and they didn't know what to do about it. As Patricia was listening to the couple tell this story, she couldn't help but feel like they were being very honest. They seemed very earnest as they're telling the story. Like, they weren't trying to dramatize. They were trying to relay what amounted to, trauma. They both clearly did not like going in the castle. It was like this thing they had to do due to Remy's job, but they were trapped. They felt like, we don't know what to do here and no one's taking us seriously. But at the same time, Patricia is a veteran, psychic medium, and she's been to numerous house calls, numerous haunted homes, and, many times, the screams people think they hear in their home are like, the sound of wind coming in through an open window, and the footsteps are like, a pet somewhere in the house. So there could easily be, a reasonable justification here, but it seemed apparent that there was enough here that it certainly warranted Patricia actually going to the castle and having a look around. And so she said, okay, let's go over. Let's go see the castle. A few minutes later, Patricia followed Béranger and Remy along this wooded path from the cottage over to the castle. Even from pretty far away, the castle was huge and very intimidating. There were two very tall round towers on either end, and in the middle was a slightly shorter section that was decorated with a bunch of turrets. The castle only had two windows that were visible from the front where they were approaching. And for a second, as Patricia was looking at it, she had this sort of uneasy feeling that the windows were the eyes on the castle and the castle was looking at her. But she shook the feeling off and kept walking along. And a few minutes later, they reached the castle's huge front door. And at this point, Remy pulled out this huge key ring covered in keys, and he unlocked the door. And then he kind of stepped aside and pushed it open, sort of gesturing for Patricia to make her way inside. Now, Patricia was doing her best to be very professional and, not quite buy into the hype, at least not yet. This could be something completely rational. But when Patricia walked into the castle, she found herself inside of this huge empty space called the Great Hall. And the first thing she noticed was really how dark and cold it was inside. I mean, this was a castle, of course, and so that was sort of the atmosphere you'd expect, but this felt like eerie. Like this was not a place you'd want to spend a lot of time. And also, it just felt like the atmosphere was just heavy somehow. Like it really was just a tense place to be. Patricia took a deep breath and kind of centered herself, and then she looked around a bit more closely, and she saw there were a few windows on the back wall, but they were all shut. And then right in front of her was this huge stone staircase. And to her right and to her left, she could see there were long hallways that she knew must lead to dozens of rooms potentially. And so after standing there for a few moments, just kind of taking in the scene, Patricia turned to Béranger and she asked her, she said, okay, so you've heard footsteps, upstairs when this place was empty. Can you tell me what you were doing, in any of the instances where those sounds came through? Like, what were you doing? Do you remember? And Béranger said, actually, yeah, I do remember. The last time it happened, I was closing the shutters on the window. And I know I heard people upstairs when I was doing that. And so immediately, Patricia's thinking, oh, that could be it. Maybe it was literally the sound the shutters were making that maybe somehow gave Béranger the impression that there were footsteps elsewhere inside of this castle. I mean, everything echoes inside of here. It's this big cavernous space. It was possible. And so Patricia's like, okay, well, let's go test the shutters. Let's just see if maybe that is causing some strange sounds in your home. And Béranger and Remy did not seem remotely offended by this. If anything, they were like eager to find a rational explanation for whatever it was they were experiencing. And so quickly, they, along with Patricia, walked over to one of the windows, and Patricia reached out and she opened up the shutters and then shut the shutters and then did it a few more times. But there were no strange sounds. There certainly were no sounds of footsteps running around inside of the castle. Like, there was no way that the shutters were making sounds that you could confuse for footsteps. Like, this was not it. However, Patricia decided she would, just in case, try another shutter. See if maybe one of the other shutters made strange sounds, just to confirm really this is not the case. But as she reached for this other shutter, before she even touched it, there was this loud, sudden, high-pitched shrieking sound that echoed all through the castle from upstairs, and then it just went deadly silent. And immediately the hairs on the back of Patricia's neck stood up. I mean, this was like an unmistakable sound. And Patricia, she turns to Remy and Béranger, and they're obviously spooked. I mean, they've experienced stuff like this, but this is still just so terrifying. And Patricia, she's standing there not even sure what to do, but then she tells herself, like, wait a minute. That couldn't have been what we thought it was. There's no way that was like some screech coming from some ghost upstairs. Like, there has to be a logical explanation here. And part of the reason she was thinking this is even in, her time as a psychic medium, nothing this visceral had ever happened in her career. Something like that was out of a movie, like literally a ghost screeching upstairs. And so Patricia turns to the couple and she's like, look, obviously I heard that too, but let's not rule out that could have been the wind or something. Let's not jump to conclusions here, okay? Let's be rational, let's be pragmatic, let's just search the castle and see what we're up against. And so the couple, Remy and Béranger, they did not seem reassured, but they kind of nodded along like, whatever you say. But then, like before anyone could do anything else, there was another sudden, loud, high-pitched scream coming from somewhere else upstairs. A different voice is now screaming upstairs. And then it went deadly silent again, and then it was very clear to Patricia, and certainly to the couple, that this castle might just be haunted. There's something going on here that is not right. However, as Patricia is standing there kind of trying to get her bearings of like what she should even suggest they do, because suddenly she is like the expert in charge of the response here, before she could even think, she had this very powerful feeling come over her that she would sort of describe as like a pull. It was like a magnet was pulling her in the direction of these screams. Like she felt like she needed to go upstairs to the second floor to wherever those screams came from. She had to. And it wasn't even clear if this was like her channeling her psychic medium powers. It was like the castle was pulling her deeper and deeper inside of the structure. And so without even telling Remy and Béranger what she was doing, Patricia just kind of silently turned and began walking almost against her will towards that stone staircase that went up to the upper levels. And now at this point, the castle is deadly silent. All you can hear is the sound of their footsteps as they're making their way over towards the staircase. And, Remy and Béranger, they're so frightened. They're just, tucked up right behind Patricia, following her along, not even sure what they should be doing. And so upstairs they went, and Patricia, again, she's got like this intense feeling that she has to go upstairs. She can't even control it. And so up the stairs she goes, no one's talking. All they hear is the sound of the footsteps on the staircase, and up they go, all the way up to the third floor, which is, where these screams were likely coming from. And at that point, Patricia, almost on instinct, turned left and began walking down this long hallway with all these doors that were shut along the way. And again, the castle is just deadly quiet. All you can hear are their footsteps. And down the hallway they go, all the way to a dead end where there is a single room that is shut at the very end of the hallway. And at this point, Patricia, almost like without even thinking, she turns and kind of almost aggressively says to Remy, "Get your keys out and open this door." Like she didn't even know why she was being aggressive. It was like just coming through her. But Béranger at this point, she chimes in and says, the owner of the castle, they told us this is the one room we're not allowed to go in. We've never been inside of here. We can't go in here. Patricia, she just looks at Béranger and says, "I don't care. We have to go in. Open the door. I'm going in. I have to go in this room." And so at this point, Béranger, she looks at her husband, and Remy kind of shrugged. I mean, they didn't even know what they're supposed to do at this point, but they figured, all right, she's the expert, let's let her go in. And so Remy, he pulled out his big set of keys and he fumbled through them all. And Patricia, she's rearing to go in this room. She can't even understand why she feels this way. And Remy, he reaches over, he turns the lock, he pushes the door open, and Patricia walks inside. Now, as soon as this door opened up, Remy and Béranger got a look inside of this room. And it was unremarkable. It was like a vacant room. There was nothing inside of it. Like, there was no clear reason why this room was off limits per the owner. But as they watched Patricia walk to the middle of the room sort of slowly and methodically and come to a stop right in the middle with her back to them, they could have sworn they heard whispers suddenly picking up inside of this room, even though there's nobody else in there but Patricia. And then Patricia, who by this point was sort of, freaking out Béranger and Remy, she was acting just very different than when she had first arrived. She just stood there in this sort of bizarre way, just like rigid, staring towards the back of this room as these whispers are kind of going on in this dark room. And then from the threshold, Béranger and Remy watched as Patricia, who has not turned around yet or anything, she just began to twitch, like her shoulders were moving around funny and her neck was snapping in a strange direction. And then she began letting out this just awful croaking sound, this constant, like, single-tone croaking sound. And it went on for so long that you'd think she would have need to take in a breath to then continue this croaking sound, but she didn't. It just went on and on and on, just emanating from her body. And, Remy and Béranger, they're terrified at this point for a host of reasons, but really it's now Patricia that's scaring them the most. And Patricia, as she's twitching and croaking, she suddenly stops and whips around and looks at the couple, and her mouth is open, like her jaw is slack, and this croaking sound is still coming out of her, but clearly she's also weeping. Tears are coming down her face. Now, Remy and Béranger, they are beyond terrified at this point for so many reasons, but they clearly know some kind of crisis is unfolding with Patricia, and they want to help her, and they were about to ask her, like, what can we do? Like, what's going on? When there's this loud slamming sound somewhere else in the castle on one of the lower levels. It sounded like a door slamming shut, but really loud. And it was like the noise snapped Patricia out of whatever trance she was in, and suddenly she became really focused. And then instead of communicating with the couple, she just bolted right past them, sprinted down the hallway, and ran down the stairs, like she was chasing after the sound that had just been made somewhere downstairs. And so Remy and Béranger, they're like, what else can we do but follow her? And so they run down the hallway, several, lengths behind Patricia, who's somewhere downstairs, and they get down to the second floor, the couple does, and they can hear the sound of movement in one of the rooms down the hallway. And then they hear this loud, animalistic yelling sound that appears to be, Patricia yelling or growling or something somewhere in one of these rooms. And so they make their way in that direction, and they see there's this open door that leads into a bedroom, and then there's a bathroom off the bedroom. They go in and they look in that bathroom, and there's Patricia, and her back is to them, and she's on her knees, and she's visibly weeping, and she's looking up at something in the room. She was kind of at an angle where they could see her face, and her face is contorted just in horror, and she's seeing something in the bathroom that is just completely terrifying her, but there's nothing in the bathroom. And so Remy and Béranger, they walk in there and they grab Patricia, who did not want to leave, but they drag her out of the bathroom, they stand her up, and they literally forcibly remove her from the castle. Several hours later, Béranger and Remy were back inside of their cottage, sitting in their living room with all these papers scattered in front of them on their coffee table. And next to them was Patricia, who by this point, she was basically back to normal, but she was still very shaken up by what happened in the castle. And also by this point, she was able to explain to the couple what had happened, from her perspective in the castle. She basically told them that she did basically, go into a trance. She had a psychic medium experience, but she had never had anything like this before. This was visceral. This was way beyond anything she had ever experienced in her entire career. According to Patricia, when she had walked into that locked room on the third floor of the castle, the forbidden room, the room was not empty. When she went in there, she had that calling to go in there. And as soon as the door opened, what she saw was a room filled with people, with basically entities, ghosts, if you will. Béranger and Remy couldn't see them, but Patricia could. And she said all these entities were wearing different clothes, like from different time periods. There were people in medieval peasant outfits, and there were people wearing Victorian dresses, and there were people wearing, very modern 20th century business suits. But that really wasn't the initial impression that Patricia got. That was just something she noticed. What she immediately picked up on when she was called into that room and saw these entities is how lost and sort of scared these ghosts seemed, like they were in trouble. And Patricia, she said, she felt like she was pulled into the center of the room and then felt kind of anchored there. And as she stood there, these ghosts basically began crowding in on her, like they were trying to get her help by getting closer to her. But she felt like overcome with this almost claustrophobic feeling of being suffocated by their sadness, not even by their physical presence. It was like their loneliness and desperation was like washing over her, and it was so awful it made her weep. And then eventually, Patricia said she was able to kind of force her body to whip around and look at least in the direction of the exit, because she wanted to leave at this point. And it was at that point that, she's making this groaning sound, which she didn't even recall. And she hears this loud slamming sound, which was the door slamming downstairs. And that kind of spooked the entities away from her, and she was able to bolt from the room. And Patricia said when she got out into the hallway and basically began maneuvering in the direction of the slammed door, because again, she had this intense sense of being pulled in the direction of this noise, she said it felt very different than when she had been pulled up to the third floor. She said now, in retrospect, when she had been pulled up there, what she was being pulled by didn't seem malevolent. It seemed, neutral or maybe even positive. But as soon as she was going in the direction of this slammed door down on the second floor, she said it felt totally different. There was obviously like a dark presence, like something bad was pulling her towards them. But still, almost against her will, she ran down the hallway, she went down the stairs, and she made her way into that bedroom, with Béranger and Remy following closely behind. And Patricia said she eventually turned and went into this bathroom in this bedroom. And when she went in there, she saw something that was so terrifying, she just fell to her knees and began to scream. That was that like animalistic wailing sound that the couple heard. What she saw was this enormous, tall, just like dark figure. It was a ghost of this tall man of sorts with like these deep scars all over his face. And he was wearing this rusted chainmail armor, like he was from a different time. And he just seemed evil, like a dark, dark presence. And she knew that was the feeling she was getting. It was coming from this ghost. And it was only because Remy and Béranger came in and basically pulled her away that she thinks she even survived. Like she was being pulled to her death. Like that's the way it felt. But again, fortunately, she's pulled out of the castle. They go back to the cottage. Patricia, had her chance to calm down. And now the three of them were trying to basically decipher what just happened. Like what can we take from this unbelievable story that Patricia has told us and what they witnessed? And what they quickly settled on was, we have a lot that we can begin to explore here, but let's focus on that evil entity, that tall man in the rusted chainmail armor. Who was that? And what did he want? So she and Remy, in the hours since they had escaped the castle, had gathered up a bunch of their historical documents about the castle and laid them out on the coffee table, and they had begun going through them to try to learn about this guy. And at some point, as they were looking through all these documents, there was one particular section that, for whatever reason, just drew, Patricia's attention. She just thought, I want to look at that. And it was the section about a knight whose name was Jean, who had lived in the 14th century. And the document said that Jean had been a soldier during the 100 Years' War, which was a conflict between England and France that had started in the mid-1300s. And during that war, the castle was used as a French military fortress. And Jean was killed during a battle at the castle. And so after Patricia read this out loud to Béranger and Remy, Patricia said she just had this feeling that the evil spirit, the tall man in the armor she saw in the bathroom that scared her so much, she had a feeling that, she didn't know why, but that seemed like Jean. However, even if Patricia had been right that this evil spirit she encountered was Jean, they still didn't know, why he was there, or why he had appeared, and why he had called her to the room, or why any of this stuff had happened. Like, the whole thing really was unexplained here. Or, who were the other ghosts who were up on the 3rd floor, that apparently Patricia saw? Like, none of it made any more sense. At some point, Béranger asked Patricia, like, what do you think? What does all this mean? Like, why did this happen? What do you think? But Patricia, she really was still very shaken up by this. I mean, she was this, renowned psychic medium, but again, she had never had an experience like this. I mean, this was really terrifying. And she just was like, look, I'm overwhelmed. I need to go home. I need to go home and just think about this. I need to process what's happened here. And so, obviously Remy and Béranger, they couldn't really protest, but they also were like, man, I really don't want to be left here alone with this horrifying castle, but, you do what you got to do. And Patricia, she got up and she left. After Patricia left, Béranger and Remy both agreed that, despite the fact that Remy was the groundskeeper here and did need to look after the castle, that for now, it was just too dangerous to go in there. It was not worth it, and so they would stay away, at least until Patricia came back and they could get to the bottom of this. And for a couple of days, with Remy and Béranger staying away from the castle, like, they had normal lives. I mean, nothing strange happened at all. They just basically lived in their cottage and went about their lives, sort of keeping the castle over here. But after a couple of days, when still Patricia had not come back again, she was still at her home, still processing this whole thing, Béranger started having this weird feeling in her chest. It was like this need to go to the castle, not dissimilar from how Patricia had described, like, this overwhelming sense of being pulled up to the 3rd floor when she was describing her whole encounter, her whole experience. Béranger, she tried to act like this wasn't happening to her, but she couldn't deny it. It's like she just had this feeling of, I gotta go to the castle, I gotta go over there. And then one day, Remy looked out the window of the cottage and he sees his wife, Béranger, walking right towards the front door of this castle. And he's thinking, there's no way she should be going in there. We agreed not to go in. Like, what is she doing? And he literally ran over there and grabbed her and pulled her back before she went into the castle, which is exactly what she was going to do. And then when she was pulled away, she couldn't even describe why she was over there. She's like, I don't even know. I just felt like I had to come over here. I can't explain it. But that wasn't even the strangest thing that happened over these few days after the incident with Patricia. Because shortly after, Béranger almost walked back into the castle, a man had come on the castle grounds. This random man sort of wandered on to the castle grounds and was apparently being drawn, although he kind of framed it differently. He didn't really know why he was there, but he was drawn towards the castle. And as he's walking towards this castle, a deer presumably was also being drawn to the castle, and the deer went running towards the castle and actually rammed into this man and hurt him badly enough he had to be hospitalized. He actually lost an eye from being hit by this deer. And so after this happened, even though, Béranger and Remy were trying to respect Patricia, sort of giving herself some space here, because she hadn't come back, she hadn't been in touch, at this point they were like, we have to get in touch with her. Like, she's the only other person who understands how serious this is. And so Béranger called Patricia and she said, like, whatever's going on in the castle, whatever dark energy is existing in there, it's getting stronger. Now, at first, Patricia was not inclined to come back. I mean, there was a reason she had not been in touch with them since she had left. She had basically decided, like, I don't want this in my life. This is terrifying. I don't know what happened, but I don't want this in my life. But she could just tell that, Béranger and Remy, I mean, they were at their wits' end here and they didn't know what to do. They were lost and they were turning to Patricia more like a friend, like, hey, please come back here and support us and help us get through this. And so Patricia did agree to go back. And so sure enough, the following evening, Béranger, Remy, and Patricia were back inside the castle in the 2nd floor bathroom where Patricia had been found at the end of that horrible experience, looking up at what she believes now was Jean's ghost, this terrifying entity. And so they're in this bathroom, and Patricia had come in here in order to basically attempt an exorcism. And so she's standing in this bathroom, and sort of behind her is Béranger and Remy, and they're kind of holding each other, and Béranger is so scared she's shaking, and they're watching as Patricia, despite her own fears, She was very calm, and she was standing there with her eyes shut, and she was sort of trying to channel Jean's energy, because she didn't have that feeling being pulled, in any direction inside the castle. She was sort of choosing to channel whatever spirit was inside of this bathroom. And then at some point, Patricia appeared to sort of connect with something in the room, something that, Béranger and Remy couldn't see. The room appeared to be empty to them, but it was obvious that Patricia had sort of picked up on something, and then kind of out of nowhere, she said in this very stern, very loud voice, "Jean, show yourself." And then Béranger and Remy, they're staring at Patricia, because again, there's nothing else they can see in this room. And Patricia, she opens her eyes, and she kind of looks around the room, and then she focuses on something on the other side of the bathroom. Like she can clearly see something, like she's seeing another entity or something. Béranger and Remy are looking, and there's nothing they can see. And then Patricia, again, still very focused, eyes locked on whatever it is in the room, she says again in that stern, loud voice, "It's over. You have to move on." Like she's instructing, this entity, presumably Jean's entity, that he needs to go. He needs to move on. And for a second, it's just silent in the bathroom as Béranger and Remy kind of wait to see what's going to happen. Like, is Patricia going to go into another trance here? Like, what's going to happen? But Patricia, she seemed very calm, very forceful, and she's staring still towards the back of the bathroom. Nothing happens. It's silent. And then Patricia again says, "It's over. You have to move on." And this time, after the second time that, Patricia is given this command, Béranger and Remy, they heard the sound of banging on a door upstairs on the third floor, basically right above them. And then they hear the sound of shuffling footsteps all over the place, and then the sounds of mournful crying, and there's more banging, and Béranger and Remy, they're holding each other, they're so scared. Patricia's unmoved. She's just standing there, anchored in the room, and all this commotion's happening upstairs, and then suddenly they hear the distinct sound of a door flying open, and then all these footsteps rushing down the hallway, mixed in with the sound of crying, but it was not crying like sad, it was blissful crying. It was tears of joy as whoever was up there was charging down the hallway, down the steps, and out of the castle. At this point, it was like a calm fell over the whole castle. And Patricia, she turned away from, whatever else was inside of the bathroom, and she looked at Remy and Béranger, and she smiled, and she said, "It's over. It's okay. Everything's okay now." Patricia would tell them that she was able to actually channel the ghost that had been in the bathroom, that evil entity. And she said it was Jean. It was his ghost. And that he had been haunting their castle because he didn't know he was dead. He was stuck in a sort of purgatory where he believed he was still fighting the 100 Years' War. And so every time somebody died inside of this castle over the many, many years that he had been here, he would take their spirit prisoner up in that room on the third floor. Those were prisoners. But Patricia, during this exorcism, had said to him, "It's over. Like, the war is over. It's time to move on." And he understood that she was saying, the war is over. And at that point, Jean is the one who freed the prisoners on the third floor. That was the sound of all the prisoners being released. They were all so happy, and they fled the castle. And then at that point, Jean himself, his spirit, was finally able to rest. However, there's one more wrinkle to this story, which is shortly after the exorcism, when life sort of returned to normal for all parties, Patricia and Béranger were speaking, and Patricia at some point just kind of offhandedly said something like, "It's a good thing, Béranger, that you texted me again and got me to come back out here, because clearly I was able to help you guys. I was able to, free these spirits from the castle. What a good thing it was that you texted me again." And Béranger said, "What do you mean?" And Patricia was like, when you texted me about how the castle was sort of calling me, you were right. Like, clearly it was. And I came over and we took care of it. But Béranger was like, "I haven't texted you in months. I didn't send that text message." And Patricia, she pulled out her phone and she showed her the text where it was like, "The castle is calling you, the castle is calling you, come." And Béranger was like, "Yeah, I didn't send that to you." And to this day, Patricia, Béranger, and Remy still have no idea who sent that text to Patricia. All right, thank you all so much for joining me tonight at the campfire. And if you enjoyed this, remember, we actually have a whole playlist of campfire episodes that are ready for you to binge right now. If you want to do that, go ahead and click right here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.